Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we are beginning an incredible journey into one of the most powerful and wealthy empires in African history, the story of the Mali Empire, a civilization that rose from the savannas of West Africa to become a symbol of wealth, scholarship, trade, and political brilliance between the 13th and 16th centuries. Mali, trading empire that flourished in Western Africa from the 13th to the 16th century. The Mali Empire developed from the state of Kangaba, on the upper Niger River east of the Fouta Djallon, and is said to have been founded before 1000 CE. The Malinke inhabitants of Kangaba acted as middlemen in the gold trade during the later period of ancient Ghana. Their dislike of the Susu chief Sumangiru's harsh but ineffective rule provoked the Malinke to revolt, and in 1230 Sundiata, the brother of Kangaba's fugitive ruler, won a decisive victory against the Susu chief. The name Mali absorbed the name Kangaba at about this time. In extending Mali's rule beyond Kangaba's narrow confines, Sundiata set a precedent for successive emperors. Imperial armies secured the gold-bearing lands of Bandu and Bambuk to the south, subdued the Daïra in the northwest, and pushed along the Niger as far north as Lac Debo. Under Mansa Musa, 1307–32, Mali rose to the apogee of its power. He controlled the lands of the Middle Niger, absorbed into his empire the trading cities of Timbuktu and Gao, and imposed his rule on such South Saharan cities as Walata and on the Tagaza region of salt deposits to the north. He extended the eastern boundaries of his empire as far as the Hausa people, and to the west he invaded Takrur and the lands of the Fulani and Tukular peoples. In Morocco, Egypt, and elsewhere he sent ambassadors and imperial agents, and on his return from a pilgrimage to Mecca, 1324, established Egyptian scholars in both Timbuktu and Gao.by the 14th century. The Daïla, or Wang era, as the Muslim traders of Mali came to be called, were active throughout Western Africa. The tide that had carried Mali to success, however, impelled it ineluctably to decline. The empire outgrew its political and military strength. Gao rebelled, circa 1400, the Tuareg seized Walata and Timbuktu, 1431, the peoples of Takrur and their neighbors, notably the Wolof, threw off their subjection, and the Mossi, in what is now Burkina Faso, began to harass their Mali overlord. By about 1550 Mali had ceased to be important as a political entity. Musa I of Mali, died 1332–37, was the Mansa, emperor, of the West African Empire of Mali from 1307, or 1312. Widely considered to be the wealthiest person in history, Mansa Musa left a realm notable for its extent and riches. He built the Great Mosque at Timbuktu and is best remembered in the Middle East and Europe for the splendor of his pilgrimage to Mecca, 1324. Mansa Musa, either the grandson or the grandnephew of Sundiata, the founder of his dynasty, came to the throne in 1307. In the 17th year of his reign, 1324, he set out on his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. It was this pilgrimage that awakened the world to the stupendous wealth of Mali. Cairo and Mecca received this royal personage, whose glittering procession, in the superlatives employed by Arab chroniclers, almost put Africa's sun to shame. Traveling from his capital of Niani on the upper Niger River to Walata, Mauritania, and on to Tuat, now in Algeria, before making his way to Cairo, Mansa Musa was accompanied by an impressive caravan consisting of 60,000 men, including a personal retinue of 12,000 enslaved persons, all clad in brocade and Persian silk. The emperor himself rode on horseback and was directly preceded by 500 enslaved persons, each carrying a gold-adorned staff. In addition, Mansa Musa had a baggage train of 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold. Chroniclers at the time noted Mansa Musa's prodigious generosity and piety, as well as the fine clothes and exemplary behavior of his followers, which did not fail to create a most favorable impression. The Cairo that Mansa Musa visited was ruled by one of the greatest of the Mamluk sultans, al-Malik al-Nir. The emperor's great civility notwithstanding, the meeting between the two rulers might have ended in a serious diplomatic incident, for so absorbed was Mansa Musa in his religious observances that he was only with difficulty persuaded to pay a formal visit to the Sultan. The historian Al-Umar, who visited Cairo 12 years after the emperor's visit, found the inhabitants of the city, with a population estimated at 1 million, still singing the praises of Mansa Musa. So lavish was the emperor in his spending that he flooded the Cairo market with gold, thereby causing such a decline in its value that the market some 12 years later had still not fully recovered. Rulers of West African states had made pilgrimages to Mecca before Mansa Musa, but the effect of his flamboyant journey was to advertise both Mali and Mansa Musa well beyond the African continent and to stimulate a desire among the Muslim kingdoms of North Africa, and among many of European nations as well, to reach the source of this incredible wealth. Mansa Musa, whose empire was one of the largest in the world at that time, is reported to have observed that it would take a year to travel from one end of his empire to the other. While this was probably an exaggeration, it is known that during his pilgrimage to Mecca one of his generals, Sagmandia, Sagamandir, extended the empire by capturing the Songhai capital of Gao. The Songhai kingdom measured several hundreds of miles across, so that the conquest meant the acquisition of a vast territory. The 14th-century traveler Ibn Battuta noted that it took about 4 months to travel from the northern borders of the Mali Empire to Niani in the south. The emperor was so overjoyed by the new acquisition that he decided to delay his return to Niani and to visit Gao instead, there to receive the personal submission of the Songhai king and take the king's 2 sons as hostages. At both Gao and Timbuktu, a Songhai city almost rivaling Gao in importance, Mansa Musa commissioned Abu Ishq al-Sil, a Granada poet and architect who had traveled with him from Mecca, to build mosques. The Gao mosque was built of burnt bricks, which had not, until then, been used as a material for building in West Africa. Under Mansa Musa, Timbuktu grew to be a very important commercial city having caravan connections with Egypt and with all other important trade centers in North Africa. Side by side with the encouragement of trade and commerce, learning and the arts received royal patronage. Scholars who were mainly interested in history, Quranic theology, and law were to make the Mosque of Sankor in Timbuktu a teaching center and to lay the foundations of the University of Sankor. Mansa Musa probably died in 1332. The organization and smooth administration of a purely African empire, the founding of the University of Sankor, the expansion of trade in Timbuktu, the architectural innovations in Gao, Timbuktu, and Niani and, indeed, throughout the whole of Mali and in the subsequent Songhai Empire are all testimony to Mansa Musa's superior administrative gifts. In addition, the moral and religious principles he had taught his subjects endured after his death. Timbuktu, city in the western African country of Mali, historically important as a trading post on the trans-Saharan caravan route and as a center of Islamic culture, circa 1400 to 1600. It is located on the southern edge of the Sahara, about 8 miles, 13 kilometers, north of the Niger River. The city was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988. In 2012, in response to armed conflict in the region, Timbuktu was added to the UNESCO list of World Heritage in Danger. Timbuktu was founded about 1100 CE as a seasonal camp by Tuareg nomads. There are several stories concerning the derivation of the city's name. According to one tradition, Timbuktu was named for an old woman left to oversee the camp while the Tuareg roamed the Sahara. Her name, variously given as Tombouctou, Timbuktu, or Buktu, meant mother with a large navel, possibly describing an umbilical hernia or other such physical malady. Timbuktu's location at the meeting point of desert and water made it an ideal trading center. In the late 13th or early 14th century it was incorporated into the Mali Empire. By the 14th century it was a flourishing center for the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade, and it grew as a center of Islamic culture. 3 of Western Africa's oldest mosques, Djinguereber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya, were built there during the 14th and early 15th centuries. After an extravagant pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, the Mali Emperor Mansa Musa built the Great Mosque, Djinguereber, and a royal residence, the Madugu, the former has since been rebuilt many times, and of the latter no trace remains. The Granada architect Abu Ishq al-Sili was then commissioned to design the Sankor Mosque, around which Sankor University was established. The mosque still stands today, probably because of al-Sili's directive to incorporate a wooden framework into the mud walls of the building, thus facilitating annual repairs after the rainy season. The Tuareg regained control of the city in 1433, but they ruled from the desert. Although the Tuareg exacted sizable tributes and plundered periodically, trade and learning continued to flourish in Timbuktu. By 1450 its population increased to about 100,000. The city's scholars, many of whom had studied in Mecca or in Egypt, numbered some 25,000. In 1468 the city was conquered by the Songhai ruler Sunni al. He was generally ill-disposed toward the city's Muslim scholars, but his successor, the first ruler of the new Askia dynasty, Muhammad I Askia of Songhai, reigned 1493 to 1528, used the scholarly elite as legal and moral counselors. During the Askia period, 1493 to 1591, Timbuktu was at the height of its commercial and intellectual development. Merchants from Gadames, now in Libya, Ajila, now Ajida, Libya, and numerous other cities of North Africa gathered there to buy gold and slaves in exchange for the Saharan salt of Tagaza and for North African cloth and horses. After it was captured by Morocco in 1591, the city declined. Its scholars were arrested in 1593 on suspicion of disaffection. Some were killed during a resulting struggle, while others were exiled to Morocco. Perhaps worse still, the small Moroccan garrisons placed in command of the city offered inadequate protection, and Timbuktu was repeatedly attacked and conquered by the Bambara, Fulani, and Tuareg. European explorers reached Timbuktu in the early 19th century. The ill-fated Scottish explorer Gordon Lang was the first to arrive, 1826, followed by the French explorer René-Auguste Cayley in 1828. Cayley, who had studied Islam and learned Arabic, reached Timbuktu disguised as an Arab. After 2 weeks he departed, becoming the first explorer to return to Europe with first-hand knowledge of the city. Rumors of Timbuktu's wealth had reached Europe centuries before, owing to tales of Musia's 11th-century caravan to Mecca. In 1853 the German geographer Heinrich Barth reached the city during a 5-year trek across Africa. He, too, survived the journey, later publishing a chronicle of his travels. Timbuktu was captured by the French in 1894. They partly restored the city from the desolate condition in which they found it, but no connecting railway or hard-surfaced road was built. In 1960 it became part of the newly independent Republic of Mali. Timbuktu is now an administrative center of Mali. In the late 1990s, restoration efforts were undertaken to preserve the city's 3 great mosques, which were threatened by sand encroachment and by general decay. An even greater threat came in 2012 when Tuareg rebels, backed by Islamic militants, took control of the northern part of the country. The Tuaregs claimed the territory, which included Timbuktu, as the independent state of Azawad. However, the Tuareg rebels were soon supplanted by the Islamic militants, who then imposed their strict version of Sharia, Islamic law, on the inhabitants. The Islamic militants, in particular, one group known as Ansar Dine, deemed many of Timbuktu's historic religious monuments and artifacts to be idolatrous, and, to that end, they damaged or destroyed many of them, including tombs of Islamic saints housed at the Jingareber and Sidi Yahya mosques. Work to repair the damage began after the militants were routed from the town in early 2013. Pop, 2009, 54,453. Songhai Empire, great trading state of West Africa, flourished 15th to 16th century, centered on the middle reaches of the Niger River in what is now central Mali and eventually extending west to the Atlantic coast and east into Niger and Nigeria. Though the Songhai people are said to have established themselves in the city of Gao about 800 CE, they did not regard it as their capital until the beginning of the 11th century during the reign of the Dia king, Kasoi, a Songhai convert to Islam. Gao so prospered and expanded during the next 300 years that from 1325 to 1375 the rulers of Mali added it to their empire. About 1335 the Diel line of rulers gave way to the Sunni, or Shur, one of whom, Sulaymanmar, is said to have won back Gao's independence. The century or so of vicissitudes that followed was ended by the accession about 1464 of Sunni al, also known as al-Biyar, died 1492. By repulsing a Mossi attack on Timbuktu, the second most important city of Songhai, and by defeating the Dogon and Fulani in the hills of Bandiagara, he had by 1468 rid the empire of any immediate danger. He later evicted the Tuareg from Timbuktu, which they had occupied since 1433, and, after a siege of 7 years, took Gen in 1473 and by 1476 had dominated the lakes region of the middle Niger to the west of Timbuktu. He repulsed a Mossi attack on Wallata to the northwest in 1480 and subsequently discouraged raiding by all the inhabitants of the Niger Valley's southern periphery. The civil policy of Sunni al was to conciliate the interests of his pagan pastoralist subjects with those of the Muslim city dwellers, on whose wealth and scholarship the Songhai Empire depended. His son Sunni Baru, reigned 1493, who sided completely with the pastoralists, was deposed by the rebel Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr Tur, also known as Muhammad I Askia, reigned 1493 to 1528, who welded the central region of the western Sudan into a single empire. He too fought the Mossi of Utenga, tackled Borgu, in what is now northwestern Nigeria, 1505, albeit with little success, and mounted successful campaigns against the Daira, 1512, against the kingdom of Fututoro in Senegal, and to the east against the Hausa states. In order to win control of the principal caravan markets to the north, he ordered his armies to found a colony in and around Agadez in Air. He was deposed by his eldest son, Musa, in 1528. Ghana, first of the great medieval trading empires of Western Africa, fluid 7th to 13th century. It was situated between the Sahara and the headwaters of the Senegal and Niger rivers, in an area that now comprises southeastern Mauritania and part of Mali. Ghana was populated by Sonic clans of Mande-speaking people who acted as intermediaries between the Arab and Amazigh, Berber, salt traders to the north and the producers of gold and ivory to the south. The empire should not be confused with the modern Republic of Ghana. An unconfirmed tradition dates the origins of the kingdom to the 4th century CE. Nothing is known of the political history of Ghana under its early kings. The first written references to the empire are those of Arabic geographers and historians from the 8th century, and it seems certain that, by 800, Ghana had become rich and powerful. Called Wagadu by its rulers, it derived its more familiar name from the king's title of Ghana. The king was able to enforce obedience from lesser groups and to exact tribute from them. Much of the empire was ruled through tributary princes who were probably the traditional chiefs of these subject clans. The Ghanaian king also imposed an import-export tax on traders and a production tax on gold, which was the country's most valuable commodity. According to the 11th century Spanish-Arab chronicler Abu Ubayd al-Bakri, the king welcomed to his capital many of the northern African traders of the Sahara, who, after the Arab conquest in the 8th century, had been converted to Islam. In the course of Ghana's history the capital was moved from one place to another. That of the 11th century has been tentatively identified by archaeologists as Kumbi, or Kumbi Sala, 200 miles, 322 kilometers, north of modern Bamako, Mali. The principal raison d'etre of the empire was the desire to control the trade in alluvial gold, which had led the nomadic Amazigh peoples of the desert to develop the western trans-Saharan caravan road. Gold was secured, often by mute barter, at the southern limits of the empire and was conveyed to the empire's capital, where a Muslim commercial town developed alongside the native city. There the gold was exchanged for commodities, the most important of which was salt, that had been transported southward by northern African caravans. As Ghana grew richer it extended its political control, strengthening its position as an entrepot by absorbing lesser states. It also incorporated some of the gold-producing lands to its south and such South-Saharan cities to the north as Ouaghost, a famous market that has since disappeared. Ghana began to decline in the 11th century with the emergence of the Muslim Almoravids, a militant confederation of the Anja and other Amazigh groups of the Sahara who combined in a holy war to convert their neighbors. Abu Bakr, the leader of this movement's southern wing, took Ouaghost in 1054 and, after many battles, seized Kumbi in 1076. The Almoravids' domination of Ghana lasted only a few years, but their activities upset the trade on which the empire depended, and the introduction of their flocks into an arid agricultural terrain initiated a disastrous process of desertification. The subject peoples of the empire began to break away, and in 1203, one of these, the Susu, occupied the capital. In 1240 the city was destroyed by the Mande Emperor Sundiata, and what was left of the Empire of Ghana was incorporated into his new Empire of Mali Gen, ancient trading city and center of Muslim scholarship, southern Mali. It is situated on the Bani River and on floodlands between the Bani and Niger rivers, 220 miles, 354 kilometers southwest of Timbuktu. The city, which sits on hillocks, small hills, known as Togare, becomes an island during the area's seasonal flooding. There is some uncertainty surrounding the establishment of Gen. It was likely founded sometime between the 8th and the 13th century. It is near the site of Gengino, an ancient city dating as far back as 250 BCE, one of the oldest known cities in sub-Saharan Africa, that had fallen into decline near the time that Gen was established. Gen grew into an entrepot between the traders of the central and western Sudan and those of Guinea's tropical forests. The town was likely ruled by the Mali Empire beginning in the 13th or 14th century until it was captured in 1468, or 1473, by the Songhai Emperor Suni Al. The city benefited both from its direct connection by river with Timbuktu and from its situation at the head of the trade routes to the gold mines of Bitou, now in Côte d'Ivoire, to Lobe, and to Bour. It was also an important entrepot for salt. With the defeat of the Songhai Empire by Moroccan forces in the 16th century, the town fell under Moroccan rule. By the mid-17th century, Gen was renowned as a center of Muslim learning. The city was besieged after 1818 and subsequently subdued by the Fulani ruler of Messina, Shehu Amadou Labo. He expelled those inhabitants practicing a form of Muslim worship that he disapproved of, and he allowed Gen's mosque to fall into ruin. Gen was conquered by the Tukulur Emperor Yumurtal about 1861 and was occupied by the French in 1893. Thereafter its commercial functions were taken over by the town of Mopti, situated northeast of Gen at the confluence of the Niger and Bani rivers. Under the French, Gen's large mud-walled Great Mosque was rebuilt in 1906–07. French administrators remained in Gen until just prior to Mali's independence in 1960. Gen and its environs host numerous ruins, remains, and buildings that are culturally and historically significant. As such, Gen, Gengino, and other nearby archaeological sites were collectively designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988. The most notable structure in the city is the Great Mosque, which is the largest mud construction in the world and recognized as an outstanding example of Sudanese and Sahelian architecture. Also of note are tombs of saints and traditional structures made from round mud bricks known as Gen Firi Songhai, ethno-linguistic group having more than 3 million members who inhabit the area of the Great Bend in the Niger River in Mali, extending from Lake Debo through Niger to the mouth of the Sokoto River in Nigeria. Some nomadic Songhai groups live in Mali, Niger, and southeastern Algeria. The Songhai are composed of many related groups, the most important of which are the Zarma, with more than 2 million speakers. It is widely assumed that their languages form a branch of the Nilo-Saharan language family. Songhai society traditionally was highly structured, comprising a king and nobility, free commoners, artisans, griots, bards and chroniclers, and slaves. Marriage could be polygynous, cross-cousins being preferred partners. Descent and succession are patrilineal. Cultivation, largely of cereals, is practiced intensively only during the rainy season, from June to November. Cattle are raised on a small scale, and fishing is of some importance. As a result of their advantageous location at the crossroads of Western and Central Africa, the Songhai have traditionally prospered from caravan trade. Many young Songhai have left home for the coast, especially Ghana. Adherence to Islam is a global phenomenon. Muslims predominate in some 30 to 40 countries, from the Atlantic eastward to the Pacific and along a belt that stretches across northern Africa into Central Asia and south to the northern regions of the Indian subcontinent. Arabs account for fewer than 1/5 of all Muslims, more than half of whom live east of Karachi, Pakistan. Despite the absence of large-scale Islamic political entities, the Islamic faith continues to expand, by some estimates faster than any other major religion. The Muslim religion and the life of the Prophet Muhammad are treated specifically in the article Islam. The literature, music, dance, and visual arts of Muslim peoples are treated in the article Islamic arts. Islam is also discussed in articles on individual countries or on regions in which the religion is a factor, such as Egypt, Iran, Arabia, and North Africa. See articles on individual branches or sects and concepts, for example, Islam, nation of, Sunni, Shi, Hadith. A very broad perspective is required to explain the history of today's Islamic world. This approach must enlarge upon conventional political or dynastic divisions to draw a comprehensive picture of the stages by which successive Muslim communities, throughout Islam's 14 centuries, encountered and incorporated new peoples so as to produce an international religion and civilization. In general, events referred to in this article are dated according to the Gregorian calendar, and eras are designated BCE, before the Common Era or Christian Era, and CE, Common Era or Christian Era, terms which are equivalent to BC, before Christ, and AD, Latin, Anno Domini. In some cases the Muslim reckoning of the Islamic era is used, indicated by Latin, Anno Hijri. The Islamic era begins with the date of Muhammad's migration, Hijra, to Medina, which corresponds to July 16, 622 CE, in the Gregorian calendar. In what follows, the terms Islamic world and Islamdom are used interchangeably. The term Islamic describes aspects pertaining to Islam as a religion, while Muslim as an adjective describes aspects pertaining to Islam's adherents. The term Islamicate refers to the social and cultural complex that is historically associated with Islam and the Muslims, including the function and participation of non-Islamic and non-Muslim individuals and groups within that complex. The prehistory of Islamdom is the history of Central Afro-Eurasia from Hammurabi of Babylon to the Achaemenid Cyrus II in Persia to Alexander the Great to the Sasanian Emperor Anushirvan to Muhammad in Arabia, or, in a Muslim view, from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses to Jesus to Muhammad. The potential for Muslim empire building was established with the rise of the earliest civilizations in Western Asia. It was refined with the emergence and spread of what have been called the region's axial age religions, Abrahamic, centered on the Hebrew patriarch Abraham, and Mazdean, focused on the Iranian deity Ahura Mazda, and their later relative, Christianity. It was facilitated by the expansion of trade from Eastern Asia to the Mediterranean and by the political changes thus effected. The Muslims were heirs to the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, Hebrews, even the Greeks and Indians. The societies they created bridged time and space, from ancient to modern and from east to west. In the 7th century CE, a coalition of Arab groups, some sedentary and some migratory, inside and outside the Arabian Peninsula, seized political and fiscal control in Western Asia, specifically of the lands between the Nile and Oxus, Amu Daria, rivers, territory formerly controlled by the Byzantines in the west and the Sasanians in the east. The factors that surrounded and directed their accomplishment had begun to coalesce long before, with the emergence of agrarian-based citied societies in Western Asia in the 4th millennium BCE. The rise of complex agrarian-based societies, such as Sumer, out of a subsistence agricultural and pastoralist environment, involved the founding of cities, the extension of citied power over surrounding villages, and the interaction of both with pastoralists. This type of social organization offered new possibilities. Agricultural production and intercity trading, particularly in luxury goods, increased. Some individuals were able to take advantage of the manual labor of others to amass enough wealth to patronize a wide range of arts and crafts. Of these, a few were able to establish territorial monarchies and foster religious institutions with wider appeal. Gradually, the familiar troika of court, temple, and market emerged. The new ruling groups cultivated skills for administering and integrating non-kin-related groups. They benefited from the increased use of writing and, in many cases, from the adoption of a single writing system, such as the cuneiform, for administrative use. New institutions, such as coinage, territorial deities, royal priesthoods, and standing armies, further enhanced their power. In such town and country complexes, the pace of change quickened enough so that a well-placed individual might see the effects of his actions in his own lifetime and be stimulated to self-criticism and moral reflection of an unprecedented sort. The religion of these new social entities reflected and supported the new social environments. Unlike the religions of small groups, the religions of complex societies focused on deities, such as Marduk, Isis, or Mitra, whose appeal was not limited to one small area or group and whose powers were much less fragmented. The relationship of earthly existence to the afterlife became more problematic, as evidenced by the elaborate death rites of pharaonic Egypt. Individual religious action began to compete with communal worship and ritual. Sometimes it promised spiritual transformation and transcendence of a new sort, as illustrated in the pan-Mediterranean mystery religions. Yet large-scale organization had introduced social and economic injustices that rulers and religions could address but not resolve. To many, an absolute ruler uniting a plurality of ethnic, religious, and interest groups offered the best hope of justice. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, the settled world had crystallized into four cultural core areas: Mediterranean, Nile to Oxus, Indic, and East Asian. The Nile to Oxus, the future core of Islamdom, was the least cohesive and the most complicated. Whereas each of the other regions developed a single language of high culture, Greek, Sanskrit, and Chinese, respectively, the Nile to Oxus region was a linguistic palimpsest of Irano-Semitic languages of several sorts: Aramaic, Syriac, Eastern or Iranian Aramaic, and Middle Persian, the language of Eastern Iran. In addition to its various linguistic groups, the Nile to Oxus region also differed in climate and ecology. It lay at the center of a vast arid zone stretching across Afro-Eurasia from the Sahara to the Gobi. It favored those who could deal with aridity, not only states that could control flooding, as in Egypt, or maintain irrigation, as in Mesopotamia, but also pastoralists and oasis dwellers. Although its agricultural potential was severely limited, its commercial possibilities were virtually unlimited. Located at the crossroads of the Trans-Asian trade and blessed with numerous natural transit points, the region offered special social and economic prominence to its merchants. The period from 800 to 200 BCE has been called the Axial Age because of its pivotal importance for the history of religion and culture. The world's first religions of salvation developed in the four core areas. From these traditions, for example, Judaism, Mazdaism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, derived all later forms of high religion, including Christianity and Islam. Unlike the religions that surrounded their formation, the Axial Age religions concentrated transcendent power into one locus, be it symbolized theistically or non-theistically. Their radically dualistic cosmology posited another realm, totally unlike the earthly realm and capable of challenging and replacing ordinary earthly values. The individual was challenged to adopt the right relationship with that other realm, so as to transcend mortality by earning a final resting place, or to escape the immortality guaranteed by rebirth by achieving annihilation of earthly attachment. In the Nile to Oxus region, two major traditions arose during the Axial Age: the Abrahamic in the west and the Mazdean in the east. Because they required exclusive allegiance through an individual confession of faith in a just and judging deity, they are called confessional religions. This deity was a unique all-powerful creator who remained active in history, and each event in the life of every individual was meaningful in terms of the judgment of God at the end of time. The universally applicable truth of these new religions was expressed in sacred writings. The traditions reflected the mercantile environment in which they were formed in their special concern for fairness, honesty, covenant-keeping, moderation, law and order, accountability, and the rights of ordinary human beings. These values were always potentially incompatible with the elitism and absolutism of courtly circles. Most often, as for example in the case of the Achaemenid Empire, the conflict was expressed in rebellion against the crown or was adjudicated by viewing kingship as the guarantor of divine justice, although modern Western historiography has projected an East-West dichotomy onto ancient times. Afro-Eurasian continuities and interactions were well established by the Axial Age and persisted throughout pre-modern times. The history of Islamdom cannot be understood without reference to them. Through Alexander's conquests in the 4th century BCE in 3 of the 4 core areas, the Irano-Semitic cultures of the Nile to Oxus region were permanently overlaid with Hellenistic elements, and a link was forged between the Indian subcontinent and Iran. By the 3rd century CE, cross-cutting movements like Gnosticism and Manichaeism integrated individuals from disparate cultures. Similarly organized large land-based empires with official religions existed in all parts of the settled world. The Christian Roman Empire was locked in conflict with its counterpart to the east, the Zoroastrian Mazdaean Sasanian Empire. Another Christian empire, Aksum, in East African Abyssinia, was involved alternately with each of the others. In the context of these regional interrelationships, inhabitants of Arabia made their fateful entrance into international political, religious, and economic life. The Arabian Peninsula consists of a large central arid zone punctuated by oases, wells, and small seasonal streams and bounded in the south by well-watered lands that are generally thin, sometimes mountainous coastal strips. To the north of the peninsula are the irrigated agricultural areas of Syria and Iraq, the site of large-scale states from the 4th millennium BCE. As early as the beginning of the 1st millennium BCE, the southwest corner of Arabia, the Yemen, also was divided into settled kingdoms. Their language was an Old South Arabian Semitic dialect, and their culture bore some affinity to Semitic societies in the Fertile Crescent. By the beginning of the Common Era, the 1st century AD in the Christian calendar, the major occupants of the habitable parts of the arid center were known as Arabs. They were Semitic-speaking tribes of settled, semi-settled, and fully migratory peoples who drew their name and apparently their identity from what the camel-herding Bedouin pastoralists among them called themselves, Arab. Until the beginning of the 3rd century CE, the greatest economic and political power in the peninsula rested in the relatively independent kingdoms of the Yemen. The Yemenis, with a knowledge of the monsoon winds, had evolved an exceptionally long and profitable trade route from East Africa across the Red Sea and from India across the Indian Ocean up through the peninsula into Iraq and Syria, where it joined older Phoenician routes across the Mediterranean and into the Iberian Peninsula. Their power depended on their ability to protect islands discovered in the Indian Ocean and to control the Straits of Hormuz and Aden, Bab el-Mandeb, as well as the Bedouin caravanners who guided and protected the caravans that carried the trade northward to Arab entrepôts like Petra and Palmyra. Participation in this trade was in turn an important source of power for tribal Arabs, whose livelihood otherwise depended on a combination of intergroup raiding, agriculture, and animal husbandry. By the 3rd century, however, external developments began to impinge. In the early 3rd century, Ardashir founded the Sasanian Empire in Fars. Within 70 years the Sasanian state was at war with Rome, a conflict that was to last up to Islamic times. The reorganization of the Roman Empire under Constantine the Great, with the adoption of a new faith, Christianity, and a new capital, Constantinople, exacerbated the competition with the Sasanian Empire and resulted in the spreading of Christianity into Egypt and Abyssinia and the encouraging of missionizing in Arabia itself. There Christians encountered Jews who had been settling since the 1st century, as well as Arabs who had converted to Judaism. By the beginning of the 4th century, the rulers of Abyssinia and Ptolemaic Egypt were interfering in the Red Sea area and carrying their aggression into the Yemen proper. In the first quarter of the 6th century, the proselytizing efforts of a Jewish Yemeni ruler resulted in a massacre of Christians in the major Christian center of Najran. This event invited Abyssinian Christian reprisal and occupation, which put a virtual end to indigenous control of the Yemen. In conflict with the Byzantines, the Zoroastrian Mazdaean Sasanians invaded Yemen toward the end of the 6th century, further expanding the religious and cultural horizons of Arabia, where membership in a religious community could not be apolitical and could even have international ramifications. The connection between communal affiliation and political orientations would be expressed in the early Muslim community and in fact has continued to function to the present day. The long-term result of Arabia's entry into international politics was paradoxical. It enhanced the power of the tribal Arabs at the expense of the superpowers. Living in an ecological environment that favored tribal independence and small group loyalties, the Arabs had never established lasting large-scale states, only transient tribal confederations. By the 5th century, however, the settled powers needed their hinterlands enough to foster client states. The Byzantines oversaw the Ghassanid kingdom, the Persians oversaw the Lakhmid, and the Yemenis, prior to the Abyssinian invasion, had Kinda. These relationships increased Arab awareness of other cultures and religions, and the awareness seems to have stimulated internal Arab cultural activity, especially the classical Arabic, or Muir, poetry, for which the pre-Islamic Arabs are so famous. In the north, Arabic speakers were drawn into the imperial administrations of the Romans and Sasanians. Soon certain settled and semi-settled Arabs spoke and wrote Aramaic or Persian as well as Arabic, and some Persian or Aramaic speakers could speak and write Arabic. The prosperity of the 5th and 6th centuries, as well as the intensification of imperial rivalries in the late 6th century, seems to have brought the Arabs of the interior permanently into the wider network of communication that fostered the rise of the Muslim community at Mecca and Medina, although the 6th century client states were the largest Arab polities of their day. It was not from them that a permanently significant Arab state arose. Rather, it emerged among independent Arabs living in Mecca, at the junction of major north, south and west-east routes, in one of the less naturally favored Arab settlements of the Hijaz, Alij. The development of a trading town into a city-state was not unusual, but, unlike many other Western Arabian settlements, Mecca was not centered on an oasis or located in the hinterland of any non-Arab power. Although it had enough well water and spring water to provide for large numbers of camels, it did not have enough for agriculture. Its economy depended on long-distance as well as short-distance trade. Sometime after the year 400 CE, Mecca had come under the control of a group of Arabs who were in the process of becoming sedentary. They were known as Quraysh and were led by a man remembered as Ki ibn Kilab, called al-Mujami, the unifier. During the generations before Muhammad's birth in about 570, the several clans of the Quraysh fostered a development in Mecca that seems to have been occurring in a few other Arab towns as well. They used their trading connections and their relationships with their Bedouin cousins to make their town a regional center whose influence radiated in many directions. They designated Mecca as a quarterly aram, a safe haven from the intertribal warfare and raiding that was endemic among the Bedouin. Thus, Mecca became an attractive site for large trade fairs that coincided with pilgrimage, Arabic, Hajj, to a local shrine, the Kaaba. The Kaaba housed the deities of visitors as well as the Meccan supertribal creator and covenant-guaranteeing deity, called Allah. Most Arabs probably viewed this deity as one among many, possessing powers not specific to a particular tribe. Others may have identified this figure with the god of the Jews and Christians. The building activities of the Quraysh threatened one non-Arab power enough to invite direct interference. The Abyssinians are said to have invaded Mecca in the year of Muhammad's birth. But the Byzantines and Sasanians were distracted by internal reorganization and renewed conflict. Simultaneously, the Yemeni kingdoms were declining. Furthermore, these shifts in the international balance of power may have dislocated existing tribal connections enough to make Mecca an attractive new focus for supertribal organization, just as Mecca's equidistance from the major powers protected its independence and neutrality. The Meccan link between shrine and market has a broader significance in the history of religion. It is reminiscent of changes that had taken place with the emergence of complex societies across the settled world several millennia earlier. Much of the religious life of the tribal Arabs had the characteristics of small group, or primitive, religion, including the sacralization of group-specific natural objects and phenomena and the multifarious presence of spirit beings, known among the Arabs as jinn. Where more complex settlement patterns had developed, however, widely shared deities had already emerged, such as the Trinity of Allah's daughters, known as Al-Lat, Manet, and Allahs. Such qualified simplification and inclusivity, wherever they have occurred in human history, seem to have been associated with other fundamental changes: increased settlement, extension and intensification of trade, and the emergence of lingua francas and other cultural commonalties, all of which had been occurring in Central Arabia for several centuries. The sedentarization of the Quraysh and their efforts to create an expanding network of cooperative Arabs generated social stresses that demanded new patterns of behavior. The ability of the Quraysh to solve their problems was affected by an ambiguous relationship between sedentary and migratory Arabs. Tribal Arabs could go in and out of sedentarization easily, and kinship ties often transcended lifestyles. The sedentarization of the Quraysh did not involve the destruction of their ties with the Bedouin or their idealization of Bedouin life. Thus, for example, did wealthy Meccans, thinking Mecca unhealthy, often send their infants to Bedouin foster mothers. Yet the settling of the Quraysh at Mecca was no ordinary instance of sedentarization. Their commercial success produced a society unlike that of the Bedouin and unlike that of many other sedentary Arabs. Whereas stratification was minimal among the Bedouin, a hierarchy based on wealth appeared among the Quraysh. Although a Bedouin group might include a small number of outsiders, such as prisoners of war, Meccan society was markedly diverse, including non-Arabs as well as Arabs, slave as well as free. Among the Bedouin, lines of protection for in-group members were clearly drawn. In Mecca, sedentarization and socio-economic stratification had begun to blur family responsibilities and foster the growth of an oligarchy whose economic objectives could easily supersede other motivations and values. Whereas the Bedouin acted in and through groups and even regularized intergroup raiding and warfare as a way of life, Meccans needed to act in their own interest and to minimize conflict by institutionalizing new, broader social alliances and interrelationships. The market shrine complex encouraged surrounding tribes to put aside their conflicts periodically and to visit and worship the deities of the Kaaba, but such worship, as in most complex societies, could not replace either the particularistic worship of small groups or the competing religious practices of other regional centers, such as Alif. Very little in the Arabian environment favored the formation of stable large-scale states. Therefore, Meccan efforts at centralization and unification might well have been transient, especially because they were not reinforced by any stronger power and because they depended almost entirely on the prosperity of a trade route that had been formerly controlled at its southern terminus and could be controlled elsewhere in the future, or exclude Mecca entirely. The rise of the Meccan system also coincided with the spread of the confessional religions, through immigration, missionization, conversion, and foreign interference. Alongside members of the confessional religions were unaffiliated monotheists, known as Ants, who distanced themselves from the Meccan religious system by repudiating the old gods but embracing neither Judaism nor Christianity. Eventually in Mecca and elsewhere a few individuals came to envision the possibility of effecting supertribal association through a leadership role common to the confessional religions, that is, prophethood or messengership. The only such individual who succeeded in effecting broad social changes was a member of the Hashim clan of Quraysh named Muhammad ibn Abd Allah ibn Abd al-Mulib. One of their own, he accomplished what the Quraysh had started, first by working against them, later by working with them. When he was born, around 570, the potential for pan-Arab unification seemed nil, but after he died, in 632, the first generation of his followers were able not only to maintain pan-Arab unification but to expand far beyond the peninsula. Any explanation of such an unprecedented development must include an analysis not only of Muhammad's individual genius but also of his ability to articulate an ideology capable of appealing to multiple constituencies. His approach to the role of prophet allowed a variety of groups to conceptualize and form a single community. Muhammad was, according to many students of social behavior, particularly well placed to lead such a social movement. In both ascribed and acquired characteristics he was unusual. Although he was a member of a high-status tribe, he belonged to one of its less well-placed clans. He was fatherless at birth, his mother and grandfather died when he was young, leaving him under the protection of an uncle. Although he possessed certain admirable personality traits to an unusual degree, his commercial success derived not from his own status but from his marriage to a much older woman, a wealthy widow named Khadija. During the years of his marriage, his personal habits grew increasingly atypical. He began to absent himself in the hills outside Mecca to engage in the solitary spiritual activity of the ants. At age 40, while on retreat, he saw a figure, whom he later identified as the angel Gabriel, who asked him to recite Iqra, then overwhelmed him with a very strong embrace. Muhammad told the stranger that he was not a reciter. But the angel repeated his demand and embrace 3 times before the verses of the Quran, beginning with "Recite in the name of thy Lord, who created," were revealed. Although a few individuals, including his wife Khadija, recognized his experience as that of a messenger of God, the contemporary religious life of most of the Meccans and the surrounding Arabs did not prepare them to share in this recognition easily. Arabs did recognize several other types of intermediaries with the sacred. Some of the kings of the Yemen are said to have had priestly functions. Tribal leaders, sheikhs, in protecting their tribe's hallowed custom, sunnah, had a spiritual dimension. Tribal Arabs also had their kahins, religious specialists who delivered oracles in ecstatic rhymed prose, saj, and read omens. And they also had their shurs, professionally trained oral poets who defended the group's honor, expressed its identity, and engaged in verbal duels with the poets of other groups. The power of the recited word was well established. The poet's words were even likened to arrows that could wound the unprotected enemy. Because Muhammad's utterances seemed similar, at least in form, to those of the kahins, many of his hearers naturally assumed that he was one of the figures with whom they were more familiar. Indeed, Muhammad might not even have attracted attention had he not sounded like other holy men, but, by eschewing any source other than the one supreme being, whom he identified as Allah, God, and whose message he regarded as cosmically significant and binding, he was gradually able to distinguish himself from all other intermediaries. Like many successful leaders, Muhammad broke through existing restraints by what might be called transformative conservatism. By combining familiar leadership roles with a less familiar one, he expanded his authority. By giving existing practices a new history, he reoriented them. By assigning a new cause to existing problems, he resolved them. His personal characteristics fit his historical circumstances perfectly. Muhammad's first vision was followed by a brief lull, after which he began to hear messages frequently, entering a special physical state to receive them and returning to normalcy to deliver them orally. Soon he began publicly to recite warnings of an imminent reckoning by Allah that disturbed the Meccan leaders. Muhammad was one of their own, a man respected for his personal qualities. Yet weakening kinship ties and increasing social diversity were helping him attract followers from many different clans and also from among tribeless persons, giving all of them a new and potentially disruptive affiliation. The fundamentals of his message, delivered often in the vicinity of the Kaaba itself, questioned the very reasons for which so many people gathered there. If visitors to the Kaaba assumed, as so many Arabs did, that the deities represented by its idols were all useful and accessible in that place, Muhammad spoke, as had axial age figures before, of a placeless and timeless deity that not only had created human beings, making them dependent on him, but would also bring them to account at an apocalypse of his own making. In place of time or chance, which the Arabs assumed to govern their destiny, Muhammad installed a final reward or punishment based on individual actions. Such individual accountability to an unseen power that took no account whatsoever of kin relationships and operated beyond the Meccan system could, if taken seriously, undermine any authority the Quraysh had acquired. Muhammad's insistence on the protection of the weak, which echoed Bedouin values, threatened the unbridled amassing of wealth so important to the Meccan oligarchy, yet Muhammad also appealed to the town dweller by describing the human being as a member of a polis, city-state, and by suggesting ways to overcome the inequities that such an environment breeds. By insisting that an event of cosmic significance was occurring in Mecca, he made the town the rival of all the greater cities with which the Meccans traded. To Meccans who believed that what went on in their town and at their shrine was hallowed by tribal custom, sunnah, Muhammad replied that their activities in fact were a corrupt form of a practice that had a very long history with the God of whom he spoke. In Muhammad's view, the Kaaba had been dedicated to the aniconic worship of the one God, Allah, by Abraham, who fathered the ancestor of the Israelites, Isaac, as well as the ancestor of the Arabs, Ishmael. Muhammad asked his hearers not to embrace something new but to abandon the traditional in favor of the original. He appealed to his fellow Quraysh not to reject the sunnah of their ancestors but rather to appreciate and fulfill its true nature. God should be worshipped not through offerings but through prayer and recitation of his messages, and his house should be emptied of its useless idols. In their initial rejection of his appeal, Muhammad's Meccan opponents took the first step toward accepting the new idea. They attacked it. For it was their rejection of him, as well as his subsequent rejection by many Jews and Christians, that helped to forge Muhammad's followers into a community with an identity of its own and capable of ultimately incorporating its opponents. Muhammad's disparate following was exceptionally vulnerable, bound together not by kinship ties but by a generic monotheism that involved being faithful, mu'min, to the message God was sending through their leader. Their vulnerability was mitigated by the absence of formal municipal discipline, but their opponents within the Quraysh could apply informal pressures ranging from harassment and violence against the weakest to a boycott against Muhammad's clan, members of which were persuaded by his uncle Abu Lib to remain loyal even though most of them were not his followers. Meanwhile, Muhammad and his closest associates were thinking about reconstituting themselves as a separate community in a less hostile environment. About 615 some 80 of his followers made an emigration, hijra, to Abyssinia, perhaps assuming that they would be welcome in a place that had a history of hostility to the Meccan oligarchy and that worshipped the same God who had sent Muhammad to them, but they eventually returned without establishing a permanent community. During the next decade, continued rejection intensified the group's identity and its search for another home. Although the boycott against Muhammad's clan began to disintegrate, the deaths of his wife and his uncle, about 619, removed an important source of psychological and social support. Muhammad had already begun to preach and attract followers at market gatherings outside Mecca. Now he intensified his search for a more hospitable environment. In 620 he met with a delegation of followers from Yathrib, an oasis about 200 miles, 320 kilometers, to the northeast. In the next 2 years their support grew into an offer of protection. Like Mecca, Yathrib was experiencing demographic problems. Several tribal groups coexisted, descendants of its Arab Jewish founders as well as a number of pagan Arab immigrants divided into two tribes, the Aws and the Khazraj. Unable to resolve their conflicts, the Yathribis invited Muhammad to perform the well-established role of neutral outside arbiter, Akam. In September 622, having discreetly sent his followers ahead, he and one companion, Abu Bakr, completed the community's second and final emigration, barely avoiding Quraysh attempts to prevent his departure by force. By the time of the emigration, a new label had begun to appear in Muhammad's recitations to describe his followers, in addition to being described in terms of their faithfulness, iman, to God and his messenger. They were also described in terms of their undivided attention, that is, as Muslims, individuals who assumed the right relationship to God by surrendering, Islam, to his will. Although the designation Muslim, derived from Islam, eventually became a proper name for a specific historical community, at this point it appears to have expressed commonality with other monotheists. Like the others, Muslims faced Jerusalem to pray. Muhammad was believed to have been transported from Jerusalem to the heavens to talk with God, and Abraham, Noah, Moses, David, and Jesus, as well as Muhammad, all were considered to be prophets, nabis, and messengers of the same God. In Yathrib, however, conflicts between other monotheists and the Muslims sharpened their distinctiveness. As an autonomous community, Muslims might have become a tribal unit like those with whom they had affiliated, especially because the terms of their immigration gave them no special status. Yet under Muhammad's leadership they developed a social organization that could absorb or challenge everyone around them. They became Muhammad's Ummah, community, because they had recognized and supported God's emissary, Rasul Allah. The Ummah's members differed from one another not by wealth or genealogical superiority but by the degree of their faith and piety, and membership in the community was itself an expression of faith. Anyone could join, regardless of origin, by following Muhammad's lead, and the nature of members' support could vary. In the concept of Ummah, Muhammad supplied the missing ingredient in the Meccan system, a powerful abstract principle for defining, justifying, and stimulating membership in a single community. Muhammad made the concept of Ummah work by expanding his role as arbiter so as to become the sole spokesman for all residents of Yathrib, also known as Medina. Even though the agreement under which Muhammad had emigrated did not obligate non-Muslims to follow him except in his arbitration, they necessarily became involved in the fortunes of his community. By protecting him from his Meccan enemies, the residents of Medina identified with his fate. Those who supported him as Muslims received special designations. The Medinans were called Ansar, helpers, and his fellow emigrants were distinguished as Muhajirin, emigrants. He was often able to use revelation to arbitrate, because the terms of his emigration did not provide adequate financial support. He began to provide for his community through caravan raiding, a tactic familiar to tribal Arabs. By thus inviting hostility, he required all the Medinans to take sides. Initial failure was followed by success, first at Nakhla, where the Muslims defied Meccan custom by violating one of the truce months so essential to Meccan prosperity and prestige. Their most memorable victory occurred in 624 at Badr, against a large Meccan force. They continued to succeed, with only one serious setback, at Ud in 625. From that time on, conversion to Islam involved joining an established polity, the successes of which were tied to its proper spiritual orientation, regardless of whether the convert shared that orientation completely. During the early years in Medina, a major motif of Islamic history emerged: the connection between material success and divine favor, which had also been prominent in the history of the Israelites. During these years, Muhammad used his outstanding knowledge of tribal relations to act as a great tribal leader, or sheikh, further expanding his authority beyond the role that the Medinans had given him. He developed a network of alliances between his Ummah and neighboring tribes, and so competed with the Meccans at their own game. He managed and distributed the booty from raiding, keeping 1/5 for the Ummah's overall needs and distributing the rest among its members. In return, members gave a portion of their wealth as zakat, to help the needy and to demonstrate their awareness of their dependence on God for all of their material benefits. Like other sheikhs, Muhammad contracted numerous, often strategically motivated, marriage alliances. He was also more able to harass and discipline Medinans, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, who did not support his activities fully. He agitated in particular against the Jews, one of whose clans, the Banu Kainuk, he expelled. Increasingly estranged from non-responsive Jews and Christians, he reoriented his followers' direction of prayer from Jerusalem to Mecca. He formally instituted the Hajj to Mecca and fasting during the month of Ramadan as distinctive cultic acts, in recognition of the fact that Islam, a generic act of surrender to God, had become Islam, a proper name identity distinguished not only from paganism but from other forms of monotheism as well. As more and more of Medina was absorbed into the Muslim community and as the Meccans weakened, Muhammad's authority expanded. He continued to lead a three-pronged campaign, against non-supporters in Medina, against the Quraysh in Mecca, and against surrounding tribes, and he even ordered raids into southern Syria. Eventually Muhammad became powerful enough to punish non-supporters severely, especially those who leaned toward Mecca. For example, he had the men of the Quraysh clan of Jews in Medina executed after they failed to help him against the Meccan forces at the Battle of the Ditch in 627. But he also used force and diplomacy to bring in other Jewish and Christian groups. Because they were seen, unlike pagans, to have formed ummas of their own around a revelation from God, Jews and Christians were entitled to pay for protection, dhimma. Muhammad thus set a precedent for another major characteristic of Islamic civilization, that of qualified religious pluralism under Muslim authority. During these years of warfare and consolidation, Muhammad continued to transmit revealed recitations, though their nature began to change. Some commented on Muhammad's situation, consoled and encouraged his community, explained the continuing resistance of the Meccans, and urged appropriate responses. Some told stories about figures familiar to Jews and Christians but cast in an Islamic framework. Though still delivered in the form of God's direct speech, the messages became longer and less ecstatic, less urgent in their warnings if more earnest in their guidance. Eventually they focused on interpersonal regulations in areas of particular importance for a new community, such as sexuality, marriage, divorce, and inheritance. By this time certain Muslims had begun to write down what Muhammad uttered or to recite passages for worship, alt, and private devotion. The recited word, so important among the Arab tribes, had found a greatly enlarged significance. A competitor for Muhammad's status as God's messenger even declared himself among a non-member tribe. He was Musaylima of Yamama, who claimed to convey revelations from God. He managed to attract numerous Bedouin Arabs but failed to speak as successfully as Muhammad to the various available constituencies. Activism in the name of God, both non-military as well as military, would become a permanent strand in Muslim piety. Given the environment in which Muhammad operated, his ummah was unlikely to survive without it. To compete as leader of a community, he needed to exhibit military prowess. Like most successful leaders, however, Muhammad was a moderate and a compromiser. Some of his followers were more militant and aggressive than he, and some were less so. In addition, circumstantial necessity had ideological ramifications. Because Muhammad as messenger was also, by divine providence, leader of an established community, he could easily define the whole realm of social action as an expression of faith. Thus, Muslims were able to identify messengership with worldly leadership to an extent almost unparalleled in the history of religion. There had been activist prophets before Muhammad and there were activist prophets after him, but in no other religious tradition does the image of the activist prophet, and by extension the activist follower, have such a comprehensive and coherent justification in the formative period. Muhammad's continuing success gradually impinged on the Quraysh in Mecca. Some defected and joined his community. His marriage to a Quraysh woman provided him with a useful go-between. In 628 he and his followers tried to make an Islamized Hajj but were forestalled by the Meccans. At Al-Hudaybiyah, outside Mecca, Muhammad granted a 10-year truce on the condition that the Meccans would allow a Muslim pilgrimage the next year. Even at this point, however, Muhammad's control over his followers had its limits. His more zealous followers agreed to the pact only after much persuasion. As in all instances of charismatic leadership, persisting loyalty was correlated with continuing success. In the next year the Meccans allowed a Muslim Hajj, and in the next, 630, the Muslims occupied Mecca without a struggle. Muhammad began to receive deputations from many parts of Arabia. By his death in 632 he was ruler of virtually all of it. The Meccan Quraysh were allowed to become Muslims without shame. In fact, they quickly became assimilated to the actual Muhajirin, even though they had not emigrated to Yathrib themselves. Ironically, in defeat they had accomplished much more than they would have had they achieved victory. The centralization of all of Arabia around their polity and their shrine, the Kaaba, which had been emptied of its idols to be filled with an infinitely greater invisible power. Because intergroup conflict was banned to all members of the Ummah on the basis of their shared loyalty to the emissary of a single higher authority, the limitations of the Meccan concept of Aram, according to which the city quarterly became a safe haven, could be overcome. The broader solidarity that Muhammad had begun to build was stabilized only after his death, and this was achieved, paradoxically, by some of the same people who had initially opposed him. In the next 2 years, one of his most significant legacies became apparent: the willingness and ability of his closest supporters to sustain the ideal and the reality of one Muslim community under one leader, even in the face of significant opposition. When Muhammad died, 2 vital sources of his authority ended: ongoing revelation and his unique ability to exemplify his messages on a daily basis. A leader capable of keeping revelation alive might have had the best chance of inheriting his movement, but no Muslim claimed messengership, nor had Muhammad unequivocally designated any other type of successor. The Ansar, his early supporters in Medina, moved to elect their own leader, leaving the Muhajirin to choose theirs, but a small number of Muhajirin managed to impose one of their own over the whole. That man was Abu Bakr, one of Muhammad's earliest followers and the father of his favorite wife, Isha. The title Abu Bakr took, Khalifa, Caliph, meaning deputy or successor, echoed revealed references to those who assist major leaders and even God himself. To Khalifa he appended Rasul Allah, so that his authority was based on his assistance to Muhammad as messenger of God. Abu Bakr soon confronted 2 new threats: the secession of many of the tribes that had joined the Ummah after 630 and the appearance among them of other prophet figures who claimed continuing guidance from God. In withdrawing, the tribes appear to have been able to distinguish loyalty to Muhammad from full acceptance of the uniqueness and permanence of his message. The appearance of other prophets illustrates a general phenomenon in the history of religion: the volatility of revelation as a source of authority. When successfully claimed, it has almost no competitor; once opened, it is difficult to close, and, if it cannot be contained and focused at the appropriate moment, its power disperses. Jews and Christians had responded to this dilemma in their own ways. Now it was the turn of the Muslims, whose future was dramatically affected by Abu Bakr's response. He put an end to revelation with a combination of military force and coherent rhetoric. He defined withdrawal from Muhammad's coalition as ingratitude to or denial of God, the concept of kufr. Thus he gave secession, ridda, cosmic significance as an act of apostasy punishable, according to God's revealed messages to Muhammad, by death. He declared that the secessionists had become Muslims, and thus servants of God. By joining Muhammad, they were not free not to be Muslims, nor could they be Muslims, and thus loyal to God, under any leader whose legitimacy did not derive from Muhammad. Finally, he declared Muhammad to be the last prophet God would send, relying on a reference to Muhammad in one of the revealed messages as Khatm al-Anbi, seal of the prophets. In his ability to interpret the events of his reign from the perspective of Islam, Abu Bakr demonstrated the power of the new conceptual vocabulary Muhammad had introduced. Had Abu Bakr not asserted the independence and uniqueness of Islam, the movement he had inherited could have been splintered or absorbed by other monotheistic communities or by new Islam-like movements led by other tribal figures. Moreover, had he not quickly made the ban on secession and intergroup conflict yield material success, his chances for survival would have been very slim, because Arabia's resources could not support his state. To provide an adequate fiscal base, Abu Bakr enlarged impulses present in pre-Islamic Mecca and in the Ummah. At his death he was beginning to turn his followers to raiding non-Muslims in the only direction where that was possible, the north. Migration into Syria and Iraq already had a long history. Arabs, both migratory and settled, were already present there. Indeed, some of them were already launching raids when Umar I, Abu Bakr's acknowledged successor, assumed the caliphate in 634. The ability of the Medinan state to absorb random action into a relatively centralized movement of expansion testifies to the strength of the new ideological and administrative patterns inherent in the concept of Ummah, the fusion of 2 once separable phenomena: membership in Muhammad's community and faith in Islam, the mundane and the spiritual, would become one of Islam's most distinctive features. Becoming and being Muslim always involved doing more than it involved believing. On balance, Muslims have always favored orthopraxy, correctness of practice, over orthodoxy, correctness of doctrine. Being Muslim has always meant making a commitment to a set of behavioral patterns because they reflect the right orientation to God. Where choices were later posed, they were posed not in terms of religion and politics, or church and state, but between living in the world the right way or the wrong way. Just as classical Islamic languages developed no equivalents for the words religion and politics, modern European languages have developed no adequate terms to capture the choices as Muslims have posed them. The Arab conquests are often viewed as a discrete period. The end of the conquests appears to be a convenient dividing line because it coincides with a conventional watershed, the overthrow of the Umayyad caliphs by the Abbassids. To illustrate their role in broader social and cultural change, however, the military conquests should be included in a period more than twice as long, during which the conquest of the hearts and minds of the majority of the subject population also occurred. Between 634 and 870 Islam was transformed from the badge of a small Arab ruling class to the dominant faith of a vast empire that stretched from the western Mediterranean into Central Asia. As a result of this long and gradual period of conversion, Arab cultures intermingled with the indigenous cultures of the conquered peoples to produce Islam's fundamental orientations and identities. The Arabic language became a vehicle for the transmission of high culture, even though the Arabs remained a minority. For the first time in the history of the Nile to Oxus region, a new language of high culture, carrying a great cultural fluorescence, replaced all previous languages of high culture. Trade and taxation replaced booty as the fiscal basis of the Muslim state, a non-tribal army replaced a tribal one, and a centralized empire became a nominal confederation, with all of the social dislocation and rivalries those changes imply. Yet despite continuous internal dissension, virtually no Muslim raised the possibility of there being more than one legitimate leader. Furthermore, the impulse toward solidarity, inherited from Muhammad and Abu Bakr, may have actually been encouraged by persisting minority status. While Muslims were a minority, they naturally formed a conception of Islamic dominance as territorial rather than religious, and of unconverted non-Muslim communities as secondary members. In one important respect, the Islamic faith differed from all other major religious traditions. The formative period of the faith coincided with its political domination of a rich complex of old cultures. As a result, during the formative period of their civilization, the Muslims could both introduce new elements and reorient old ones in creative ways, just as Muhammad fulfilled and redirected ongoing tendencies in Arabia. The builders of early Islamicate civilization carried forth and transformed developments in the Roman and Sasanian territories in which they first dominated. While Muhammad was emerging as a leader in the Hijaz, the Byzantine and Sasanian emperors were ruling states that resembled what the Islamicate empire was to become. Byzantine rule stretched from North Africa into Syria and sometimes Iraq. The Sasanians competed with the Byzantines in Syria and Iraq and extended their sway, at its furthest, across the Oxus River. Among their subjects were speakers and writers of several major languages, various forms of Aramaic, such as Mandean and Syriac, Greek, Arabic, and Middle Persian. In fact, a significant number of persons were probably bilingual or trilingual. Both the Byzantine and the Sasanian Empire declared an official religion, Christianity and Zoroastrian Mazdaism, respectively. The Sasanian Empire in the early 7th century was ruled by a religion-backed centralized monarchy with an elaborate bureaucratic structure that was reproduced on a smaller scale at the provincial courts of its appointed governors. Its religious demography was complex, encompassing Christians of many persuasions, Miaphysites, Nestorians, Chalcedonians, and others, pagans, Gnostics, Jews, Mazdeans. Minority religious communities were becoming more clearly organized and isolated. The population included priests, traders and merchants, landlords, dikons, sometimes living not on the land but as absentees in the cities, pastoralists, and large numbers of peasant agriculturalists. In southern Iraq, especially in and around towns like Al-Ra, it included migratory and settled Arabs as well. Both empires relied on standing armies for their defense and on agriculture, taxation, conquest, and trade for their resources. When the Muslim conquests began, the Byzantines and Sasanians had been in conflict for a century. In the most recent exchanges, the Sasanians had established direct rule in Al-Ra, further exposing its many Arabs to their administration. When the Arab conquests began, representatives of Byzantine and Sasanian rule on Arabia's northern borders were not strong enough to resist. Abu Bakr's successor in Medina, Umar I, ruled 634 to 644, had not so much to stimulate conquest as to organize and channel it. He chose as leaders skillful managers experienced in trade and commerce as well as warfare and imbued with an ideology that provided their activities with a cosmic significance. The total numbers involved in the initial conquests may have been relatively small, perhaps less than 50,000, divided into numerous shifting groups. Yet few actions took place without any sanction from the Medinan government or one of its appointed commanders. The fighters, or Mu'tala, could generally accomplish much more with Medina's support than without. Umar, one of Muhammad's earliest and staunchest supporters, had quickly developed an administrative system of manifestly superior effectiveness. He defined the Ummah as a continually expansive polity managed by a new ruling elite, which included successful military commanders like Khalid ibn al-Walid. Even after the conquests ended, this sense of expansiveness continued to be expressed in the way Muslims divided the world into their own zone, the Dar al-Islam, and the zone into which they could and should expand, the Dar al-Arb, the abode of war. The norms of Umar's new elite were supplied by Islam as it was then understood. Taken together, Muhammad's revelations from God and his Sunnah, precedent-setting example, defined the cultic and personal practices that distinguished Muslims from others: prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, charity, avoidance of pork and intoxicants, membership in one community centered at Mecca, and activism, jihad, on the community's behalf. Umar symbolized this conception of the Ummah in two ways. He assumed an additional title, Amir al-Mu'min, Commander of the Faithful, which linked organized activism with faithfulness, Iman, the earliest defining feature of the Muslim. He also adopted a lunar calendar that began with the emigration, Hijra, the moment at which a group of individual followers of Muhammad had become an active social presence. Because booty was the Ummah's major resource, Umar concentrated on ways to distribute and sustain it. He established a diwan, or register, to pay all members of the ruling elite and the conquering forces, from Muhammad's family on down, in order of entry into the Ummah. The immovable booty was kept for the state. After the government's fifth share of the movable booty was reserved, the rest was distributed according to the diwan. The Mu'tala he stationed as an occupying army in garrisons, Amr, constructed in locations strategic to further conquest, Al-Fus in Egypt, Damascus in Syria, Kufa and Basra in Iraq. The garrisons attracted indigenous population and initiated significant demographic changes, such as a population shift from northern to southern Iraq. They also inaugurated the rudiments of an Islamic daily life. Each garrison was commanded by a caliphal appointee, responsible for setting aside an area for prayer, a mosque, masjid, named for the prostrations, sujud, that had become a characteristic element in the 5 daily worship sessions, alts. There the fighters could hear God's revelations to Muhammad recited by men trained in that emerging art. The most pious might commit the whole to memory. There too, the Friday midday alt could be performed communally, accompanied by an important educational device, the sermon, khutbah, through which the fighters could be instructed in the principles of the faith. The mosque fused the practical and the spiritual in a special way. Because the Friday prayer included an expression of loyalty to the ruler, it could also provide an opportunity to declare rebellion. The series of ongoing conquests that fueled this system had their most extensive phase under Umar and his successor Uthman ibn Affan, ruled 644 to 656. Within 25 years, Muslim Arab forces created the first empire to permanently link Western Asia with the Mediterranean. Within another century, Muslim conquerors surpassed the achievement of Alexander the Great, not only in the durability of their accomplishment but in its scope as well, reaching from the Iberian Peninsula to Central Asia. Resistance was generally slight and non-destructive, and conquest through capitulation was preferred to conquest by force. After Sasanian Al-Ra fell in 633, a large Byzantine force was defeated in Syria, opening the way to the final conquest of Damascus in 636. The next year further gains were made in Sasanian territory, especially at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, and in the next the focus returned to Syria and the taking of Jerusalem. By 640 Roman control in Syria was over, and by 641 the Sasanians had lost all their territory west of the Zagros. During the years 642 to 646 Egypt was taken under the leadership of Amr ibn Ali with Makron, who soon began raids into what the Muslims called the Maghreb, the lands west of Egypt. Shortly thereafter, in the east, Persepolis fell. In 651 the defeat and assassination of the last Sasanian emperor, Yazdijerd III, marked the end of the 400-year-old Sasanian Empire. This phase of conquest ended under Utham and ramified widely. Utham may even have sent an emissary to China in 651. By the end of the 7th century Arab Muslims were trading there. The fiscal strain of such expansion and the growing independence of local Arabs outside the peninsula underlay the persisting discontents that surfaced toward the end of Utham's reign. The very way in which he was made caliph had already signaled the potential for competition over leadership and resources. Perceived as pliable and docile, he was the choice of the small committee charged by the dying Umar with selecting one of their own number. Once in office, however, Utham acted to establish the power of Medina over and against some of the powerful Quraysh families at Mecca and local notables outside Arabia. He was accused of nepotism for relying on his own family, the Banu Umayyah, whose talents Umar had already recognized. Among his many other objectionable acts was his call for the production of a single standard collection of Muhammad's messages from God, which was known simply as the Quran, recitation, or recitations. Simultaneously he ordered the destruction of any other collections. Although they might have differed only in minor respects, they represented the independence of local communities. Above all, Utham was the natural target of anyone dissatisfied with the distribution of the conquest's wealth, since he represented and defended a system that defined all income as Medina's to distribute. The difficulties of Utham's reign took more than a century to resolve. They were the inevitable result not just of the actions of individuals but of the whole process initiated by Muhammad's achievements. His coalition had been fragile. He had disturbed existing social arrangements without being able to reconstruct and stabilize new ones quickly. Into a society organized along family lines, he had introduced the supremacy of trans-kinship ties. Yet he had been forced to make use of kinship ties himself, and, despite his egalitarian message, he had introduced new inequities by granting privileges to the earliest and most intensely devoted followers of his cause. Furthermore, personal rivalries were stimulated by his charisma. Individuals like his wife Isha, his daughter Fima, and her husband Al frequently vied for his affection. Umar's Diwan had, then, reinforced old inequities by extending privileges to wealthy high-placed Meccans, and it had introduced new tensions by assigning a lower status to those, indigenous or immigrant to the provinces, who joined the cause later, but who felt themselves to be making an equivalent or greater contribution. Other tensions resulted from conditions in the conquered lands, the initial isolation of Arab Muslims, and even Arab Christians who fought with them, from the indigenous non-Arab population, the discouragement of non-Arab converts, except as clients, mawali, of Arab tribes, the administrative dependence of peninsular Arabs on local Arabs and non-Arabs, and the development of a tax system that discriminated against non-Muslims. The ensuing conflicts were played out in a series of intra-Muslim disputes that began with Utham's assassination in 656 and continued to the end of the period under discussion. The importance of kinship ties persisted, but they were gradually replaced by the identities of a new social order. These new identities resulted from Muslim responses to anti-Muslim activity as well as from Muslim participation in a series of controversies focused on the issue of leadership. Because the Ummah, unified under one leader, was seen as an earthly expression of God's favor, and because God was seen as the controller of all aspects of human existence, the identities formed in the course of the Ummah's early history could fuse dimensions that secular modern observers are able to distinguish: religious, social, political, and economic. Furthermore, intra-Muslim rivalries changed during the conversion period. The meaningfulness of the new identities expanded as non-Muslims contributed to Islam's formation, through opposition or through conversion, and the key issues broadened as the participating constituencies enlarged. At first the disputes were coterminous with intra-Arab, indeed even intra-Quraysh, rivalries. Only later did they involve persons of other backgrounds. Thus the faith of Islam was formed in conjunction with the crises that attended the establishment of rule by Muslims. Muslims might have produced an extremely localized and exclusivistic religion, but in spite of, and perhaps because of, their willingness to engage in continuing internal conflicts, they produced one of the most unified religious traditions in human history. By the end of the period of conversion and crystallization, Muslim historians would retrospectively identify 4 discrete periods of conflict and label them fitnas, trials or temptations to test the unity of the Ummah. Many historians also came to view some identities formed during the fitnas as authentic and others as deviant. This retrospective interpretation may be anachronistic and misleading. The entire period between 656 and the last quarter of the 9th century was conflict-ridden, and the fitnas merely mark periods of intensification, yet the most striking characteristic of the period was the pursuit of unity. In the first 2 fitnas the claimants to the caliphate relied on their high standing among the Quraysh and their local support in either Arabia, Iraq, or Syria. Competition for the caliphate thus reflected rivalries among the leading Arab families as well as regional interests. The first fitna occurred between Uthammah's assassination in 656 and the accession of his kinsman Muawiyah in 661 and included the Caliphate of Al, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. It involved a 3-way contest between Al's party in Iraq, a coalition of important Quraysh families in Mecca, including Muhammad's wife Isha and Ala and Zubair, and the party of Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and a member of Uthammah's clan, the Banu Umayyah. Ostensibly the conflict focused on whether Utham had been assassinated justly, whether Al had been involved, and whether Uthammah's death should be avenged by Muawiyah or by the leading Meccans. Al and his party, Shah, at first gained power over the representatives of the other leading Meccan families, then lost it permanently to Muawiyah, who elevated Damascus, which had been his provincial capital, to the status of imperial capital. Disappointed at the Battle of Ifn, 657, with Al's failure to insist on his right to rule, a segment of his partisans withdrew, accordingly calling themselves Khawarij, Kharijites, seceders. Their spiritual heirs would come to recognize any pious Muslim as leader. Meanwhile, another segment of Al's party intensified their loyalty to him as a just and heroic leader who was one of Muhammad's dearest intimates and the father of his only male descendants. The second fitna followed Muawiyah's caliphate, 661 to 680, which itself was not free from strife, and coincided with the caliphates of Muawiyah's son Yazid, ruled 680 to 683, whom he designated as successor, and Yazid's 3 successors. This fitna was a second-generation reprise of the first. Some of the personnel of the former were descendants or relatives of the leaders of the latter. Once again, different regions supported different claimants, as new tribal divisions emerged in the garrison towns, and once again, representatives of the Syrian Umayyads prevailed. In 680, at Karbala in Iraq, Yazid's army murdered al-Husayn, a son of Al and grandson of Muhammad, along with a small group of supporters, accusing them of rebellion, and even though the Umayyads subdued Iraq, rebellions in the name of this or that relative of Al continued, attracting more and more non-Arab support and introducing new dimensions to his cause. In the Hijaz, the Marwanid branch of the Umayyads, descendants of Marwan I who claimed the caliphate in 684, fought against Abd Allah ibn al-Zubair for years. By the time they defeated him, they had lost most of Arabia to Kharijite rebels, during the period of the first two fitnas, resistance to Muslim rule was an added source of conflict. Some of this resistance took the form of syncretic or anti-Islamic religious movements. For example, during the second fitna, in Iraq a Jew named Abu with Makran al-Ifan led a syncretic movement, that is, a movement combining different forms of belief or practice, on the basis of his claim to be a prophet, an option not generally open to Muslim rebels, and forerunner of the Messiah. He viewed Muhammad and Jesus as messengers sent not to all humanity but only to their own communities, so he urged each community to continue in its own tradition as he helped prepare for the coming of the Messiah. In other areas, such as the newly conquered Maghreb, resistance took the form of large-scale military hostility. In the 660s the Umayyads had expanded their conflict with the Byzantine Empire by competing for bases in coastal North Africa. It soon became clear, however, that only a full-fledged occupation would serve their purposes. That occupation was begun by Uqba ibn Fi, the founder of Al-Kairouan, Kairwa, in modern Tunisia, and, as Sidi, Saint Uqba, the first of many Maghribi Muslim saints. It eventually resulted in the incorporation of large numbers of pagan or Christianized Amazigh, plural, Imazigan, Berber, tribes, the first large-scale forcible incorporation of tribal peoples since the secession of tribes under Abu Bakr. But first the Arab armies met fierce resistance from two individuals, one a man, Kusayla, and one a woman, Al-Kahina, who became Amazigh heroes. Amazigh resistance was not controlled until the end of the 7th century, after which the Imazigan participated in the further conquest of the Maghreb and the Iberian Peninsula, during the Caliphate of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, ruled 685 to 705, which followed the end of the second fitna, and under his successors during the next 4 decades, the problematic consequences of the conquests became much more visible. Like their Byzantine and late Sasanian predecessors, the Marwanid caliphs nominally ruled the various religious communities but allowed the community's own appointed or elected officials to administer most internal affairs. Yet now the right of religious communities to live in this fashion was justified by the Quran and the Sunnah, as peoples with revealed books, al-Kitab, they deserve protection, dhimma, in return for a payment. The Arabs also formed a single religious community whose right to rule over the non-Arab protected communities the Marwanids sought to maintain. To signify this supremacy, as well as his co-optation of previous legitimacy, Abd al-Malik ordered the construction of the monumental Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, a major center of non-Muslim population. The site chosen was sacred to Jews and Christians because of its associations with biblical history. It later gained added meaning for Muslims, who believed it to be the starting point for Muhammad's midnight journey to heaven. Although the Dome of the Rock, whose original function remains unclear, and many early mosques resembled contemporary Christian churches, gradually an Islamic aesthetic emerged, a dome on a geometrical base, accompanied by a minaret from which to deliver the call to prayer, and an emphasis on surface decoration that combined arabesque and geometrical design with calligraphic representations of God's Word. Abd al-Malik took other steps to mark the distinctiveness of Islamic rule. For example, he encouraged the use of Arabic as the language of government and had Islamized coins minted to replace the Byzantine and Sasanian-style coinage that had continued to be used since the conquests. During the Marwanid period the Muslim community was further consolidated by the regularization of the public cult and the crystallization of a set of 5 minimal duties, sometimes called pillars. Yet the Marwanids also depended heavily on the help of non-Arab administrative personnel, kutub, singular katib, and on administrative practices, e.g., a set of government bureaus, inherited from Byzantine and, in particular, late Sasanian practice. Pre-Islamic writings on governance translated into Arabic, especially from Middle Persian, influenced caliphal style. The governing structure at Damascus and in the provinces began to resemble pre-Islamic monarchy, and thus appealed to a majority of subjects, whose heritage extolled the absolute authority of a divinely sanctioned ruler. Much of the inspiration for this development came from Abd al-Malik's administrator in the Eastern Territories, Alhaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, who was himself an admirer of Sasanian practice, the Marwanid caliphs, as rulers of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, had thus been forced to respond to a variety of expectations. Ironically, it was their defense of the importance and distinctiveness of the Arabic language and the Islamic community, not their responsiveness to non-Muslim preferences, that prepared the way for the gradual incorporation of most of the subject population into the Ummah. As the conquest slowed and the isolation of the fighters, Mu'tala, became less necessary, it became more and more difficult to keep Arabs garrisoned. The sedentarization of Arabs that had begun in the Hijaz was being repeated and extended outside the peninsula. As the tribal links that had so dominated Umayyad politics began to break down, the meaningfulness of tying non-Arab converts to Arab tribes as clients was diluted. Moreover, the number of non-Muslims who wished to join the Ummah was already becoming too large for this process to work effectively simultaneously. The growing prestige and elaboration of things Arabic and Islamic made them more attractive to non-Arab Muslims and to non-Muslims alike. The more the Muslim rulers succeeded, the more prestige their customs, norms, and habits acquired. Heirs to the considerable agricultural and commercial resources of the Nile to Oxus region, they increased its prosperity and widened its horizons by extending its control far to the east and west. Arabic, which occasionally had been used for administrative purposes in earlier empires, now became a valuable lingua franca. As Muslims continued to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, they needed Arabic to reflect upon and elaborate what they had inherited from the Hijaz. Because the Quran, translation of which was prohibited, was written in a form of Arabic that quickly became archaic to Muslims living in the garrisons, and because it contained references to life in Arabia before and during Muhammad's time, full understanding of the text required special effort. Scholars began to study the religion and poetry of the Jahiliyyah, the times of ignorance before God's revelation to Muhammad. Philologians soon emerged, in the Hijaz as well as in the garrisons. Many Muslims cultivated reports, which came to be known as hadith, of what Muhammad had said and done, in order to develop a clearer and fuller picture of his sunnah. These materials were sometimes gathered into accounts of his campaigns, called maghazi. The emulation of Muhammad's sunnah was a major factor in the development of recognizably Muslim styles of personal piety and public decision-making. As differences in the garrisons needed to be settled according to Islamic principles, the caliphs appointed arbitrating judges, qa with makranes, who were knowledgeable in the Quran and the Sunnah. The pursuit of legal knowledge, fiqh, was taken up in many locales and informed by local pre-Islamic custom and Islamic resources. These special forms of knowledge began to be known as ulm, singular ilm, and the persons who pursued them as ulama, ulam, singular lim, a role that provided new sources of prestige and influence, especially for recent converts or sons of converts. Muslims outside Arabia were also affected by interacting with members of the religious communities over which they ruled. When protected non-Muslims converted, they brought new expectations and habits with them. Islamic eschatology is one area that reflects such enrichment. Unconverted protected groups, dhimmis, were equally influential. Expressions of Islamic identity often had to take into account the critique of non-Muslims, just as the various non-Muslim traditions were affected by contact with Muslims. This interaction had special consequences in the areas of prophethood and revelation, where major shifts and accommodations occurred among Jews, Christians, Mazdians, and Muslims during the first 2 centuries of their coexistence. Muslims attempted to establish Muhammad's legitimacy as an heir to Jewish and Christian prophethood, while non-Muslims tried to distinguish their prophets and scriptures from Muhammad and the Quran. Within the emergent Islamicate civilization, the separate religious communities continued to go their own way, but the influence of Muslim rule and the intervention of the caliphs in their internal affairs could not help but affect them. The Babylonian Talmud, completed during these years, bears traces of early interaction among communities. In Iraq, caliphal policy helped promote the Jewish Jayans, local rabbinic authorities, over the exilarch, a central secular leader. Mazdians turned to the Nestorian Church to avoid Islam, or reconceptualized Zoroaster as a prophet sent to a community with a book. With the dhimmi system, the system of protecting non-Muslims for payment, Muslim rulers formalized and probably intensified pre-Islamic tendencies toward religious communalization. Furthermore, the greater formality of the new system could protect the subject communities from each other as well as from the dominant minority. So, converting to Islam, at least in the Nile to Oxus region, meant joining one recognizably distinct social entity and leaving another. One of the most significant aspects of many Muslim societies was the inseparability of religious affiliation and group membership, a phenomenon that has translated poorly into the social structures of modern Muslim nations. In the central caliphal lands of the early 8th century, membership in the Muslim community offered the best chance for social and physical mobility, regardless of a certain degree of discrimination against non-Arabs. Among many astounding examples of this mobility is the fact that several of the early governors and independent dynasts of Egypt and the Maghreb were grandsons of men born in Central Asia. The Marwanid Maghreb illustrates a kind of conversion more like that of the peninsular Arabs. After the defeat of initial Amazigh resistance movements, the Arab conquerors of the Maghreb quickly incorporated the Amazigh tribes en masse into the Muslim community, turning them immediately to further conquests. In 710 an Arab Amazigh army set out for the Iberian Peninsula under the leadership of Rik ibn Ziyad. The name Gibraltar is derived from Jabal Rik, or Mountain of Rik. They defeated King Roderick in 711, raided into and through the Iberian Peninsula, which they called Al-Andalus, and ruled in the name of the Umayyad Caliph. The Andalusian Muslims never had serious goals across the Pyrenees. In 732 Charles Martel encountered not a Muslim army but a summer raiding party. Despite his victory over that party, Muslims continued their seasonal raiding along the southern French coast for many years. Muslim Andalusia is particularly interesting because the pressure for large-scale conversion that was coming to plague the Umayyads in Syria, Iraq, and Iran never developed. Muslims may never have become a majority throughout their 700-year Andalusian presence. Non-Muslims entered into the Muslim realm as Mozarabs, Christians who had adopted the language and manners, rather than the faith, of the Arabs. Given essentially the same administrative arrangements, the Iberian Christian population was later restored to dominance while the Syrian Christian population was drastically reduced, but the Iberian Jewish population all but disappeared while the Nile to Oxus Jewish population survived. The Amazighan who remained in the Maghreb illustrate the mobility of ideologies and institutions from the central lands to more recently conquered territories. No sooner had they given up anti-Muslim resistance and joined the Muslim community than they rebelled again, but this time an Islamic identity, Kharijism, provided the justification. Kharijite ideas had been carried to the Maghreb by refugees from the numerous revolts against the Marwanids. Kharijite egalitarianism suited the economic and social grievances of the Amazighan as non-Arab Muslims under Arab rule. The revolts outlasted the Marwanids. They resulted in the first independent Maghribi dynasty, the Rustamid, founded by Muslims of Persian descent. The direct influence of the revolts was felt as late as the 10th century and survives among small communities in Tunisia and Algeria. Meanwhile, in the central caliphal lands, growing discontent with the emerging order crystallized in a multifaceted movement of opposition to the Marwanids. It culminated in the Third Fitna, 744 to 750, which resulted in the establishment of a new and final dynasty of caliphs, the Absids. Ever since the Second Fitna, a number of concerned and self-conscious Muslims had begun to raise serious questions about the proper Muslim life and the Marwanids' ability to exemplify it, and to answer them by reference to key events in the Ummah's history. Pious Muslims tried to define a good Muslim and to decide whether a bad Muslim should be excluded from the community, or a bad caliph from office. They also considered God's role in determining a person's sinfulness and final dispensation. The proper relationship between Arab and non-Arab Muslims, and between Muslims and dhimmis, was another important and predictable focus of reflection. The willingness of non-Arabs to join the Ummah was growing, but the Marwanids had not found a solution that was either ideologically acceptable or fiscally sound. Because protected non-Muslim groups paid special taxes, fiscal stability seemed to depend on continuing to discourage conversion. One Marwanid, Umar II, ruled 717 to 720, experimented unsuccessfully with a just solution. In these very practical and often pressing debates lay the germs of Muslim theology, as various overlapping positions, not always coterminous with political groupings, were taken, rejecting the history of the community by demanding rule by Muhammad's family, rejecting the history of the community by following any pious Muslim and excluding any sinner, or accepting the history of the community, its leaders, and most of its members. In the course of these debates the Marwanid caliphs began to seem severely deficient to a significant number of Muslims of differing persuasions and aspirations. Direct and implied criticism began to surface. Al-Hasan al-Bar, a pious ascetic and a model for the early Sufis, called on the Marwanids to rule as good Muslims and called on good Muslims to be suspicious of worldly power. Ibn Ishq composed an account of Muhammad's messengership that emphasized the importance of the Ansar, the Yathribi tribes that accepted Muhammad, and by implication the non-Arab converts, from whom Ibn Ishq himself was descended. The Marwanids were accused of bid'ah, new actions for which there were no legitimate Islamic precedents. Their continuation of pre-Islamic institutions, the spy system, extortion of deposed officials by torture, and summary execution, were some of their most visible offenses. To the pious, the ideal ruler, or imam, the word also for a Muslim who led the should, like Muhammad, possess special learning and knowledge. The first four caliphs, they argued, had been imams in this sense, but under the Umayyads the caliphate had been reduced to a military and administrative office devoid of imama, of true legitimacy. This piety-minded opposition to the Umayyads, as it has been aptly dubbed, now began to talk about a new dispensation. Some of the most vocal members found special learning and knowledge only in Muhammad's family. Some defined Muhammad's family broadly to include any Hashemite, others, more narrowly, to include only descendants of Al. As the number of Muhammad's descendants through Al had grown, numerous rebellions had broken out in the name of one or the other, drawing on various combinations of constituencies and reflecting a wide spectrum of Islamic and pre-Islamic aspirations. In the late Marwanid period, the piety-minded opposition found expression in a movement organized in Khorasan, by Abu Muslim, a semi-secret operative of one particularly ambitious Hashemite family, the Absids. The Absids, who were kin but not descendants of Muhammad, claimed also to have inherited, a generation earlier, the authority of one of Allah's actual descendants, Abu Hashim. Publicly Abu Muslim called for any qualified member of Muhammad's family to become caliph, but privately he allowed the partisans, Shah, of Al to assume that he meant them. Abu Muslim ultimately succeeded because he managed to link the concerns of the piety-minded in Syria and Iraq with Khorasanian discontent. He played upon the grievances of its Arab tribes against the tribes of Syria and their representatives in the Khorasanian provincial government, and on the millennial expectations of non-Arab converts and non-Muslims disenchanted with the injustices of Marwanid rule, when in 750 the army organized and led by Abu Muslim succeeded in defeating the last Marwanid ruler. His caliph designate represented only one segment of this broad coalition. He was the head of the Absid family, Abu al-Abs al-Saf, who now subordinated the claims of the party of Al to those of his own family and who promised to restore the unity of the Ummah, or Jama. The circumstances of his accession reconfigured the piety-minded opposition that had helped bring him to power. The party of Al refused to accept the compromise the Absids offered. Their former fellow opponents did accept membership in the reunified Jama, isolating the people of the Shah and causing them to define themselves in terms of more radical points of view. Those who accepted the early Absids came to be known as the people of the Sunnah and Jama. They accepted the cumulative historical reality of the Ummah's first century. All the decisions of the community and all the caliphs it had accepted had been legitimate, as would be any subsequent caliph who could unite the community. The concept of fitna acquired a fully historicist meaning. If internal discord were a trial sent by God, then any unifying victor must be God's choice. The historicists came to be known as Sunnis and their main opponents as Shiites. These labels are somewhat misleading because they imply that only the Sunnis tried to follow the Sunnah of Muhammad. In fact, each group relied on the Sunnah but emphasized different elements. For the Sunnis, who should more properly be called the Jam Sunnis, the principle of solidarity was essential to the Sunnah. The Shiites argued that the fundamental element of the Sunnah, and one willfully overlooked by the Jam Sunnis, was Muhammad's devotion to his family and his wish that they succeed him through al. These new labels expressed and consolidated the social reorganization that had been underway since the beginning of the conquests. The vast majority of Muslims now became consensus-oriented, while a small minority became oppositional. The inherent inimitability of Muhammad's role had made it impossible for any form of successorship to capture universal approval. When the Abbassids denied the special claims of the family of al, they prompted the Shiites to define themselves as a permanent opposition to the status quo. The crystallization of schism into a movement of protest received its greatest impetus during and just after the lifetime of one of the most influential Shiite leaders of the early Abbasid period, Jafar al-Dik, died 765. Jafar's vision and leadership allowed the Shiites to understand their chaotic history as a meaningful series of efforts by truly pious and suffering Muslims to right the wrongs of the majority. The leaders of the minority had occupied the office of Imam, the central Shiite institution, which had been passed on from the first Imam, al, by designation down to Jafar, the sixth. To protect his followers from increasing Sunni hostility to the views of radical Shiites, known as the Gulat, extremists, who claimed prophethood for al, Jafar made a distinction that both protected the uniqueness of prophethood and established the superiority of the role of Imam. Since prophethood had ended, its true intent would die without the Imams, whose protection from error allowed them to carry out their indispensable task. Although Jafar did develop an ideology that invited Sunni toleration, he did not unify all Shiites. Differences continued to be expressed through loyalty to various of his relatives. During Jafar's lifetime, his uncle Zayd revolted in Kufa, 740, founding the branch of schism known as the Zaydiyah, Zaydis, or Fivers, for their allegiance to the fifth Imam, who became particularly important in southern Arabia. Any pious follower of al could become their Imam, and any Imam could be deposed if he behaved unacceptably. The Shiite majority followed Jafar's son Musa al-Kim and Imams in his line through the 12th, who disappeared in 873. Those loyal to the 12 Imams became known as the Imamis or Ithna Ashariya, 12ers. They adopted a quietistic stance toward the status quo government of the Abbasids and prepared to wait until the 12th Imam should return as the Messiah to avenge injustices against Shiites and to restore justice before the Last Judgment. Some of Jafar's followers, however, remained loyal to Ismail, Jafar's eldest son who predeceased his father after being designated. These became the Ismailiyah, Ismails, or Sabiyah, Seveners, and they soon became a source of continuing revolution in the name of Ismail's son Muhammad al-Tam, who was believed to have disappeared. Challenges to the Abbasids were not long in coming. Of particular significance was the establishment in 789 of the first independent Shiite dynasty, in present-day Morocco, by Idris ibn Abd Allah ibn Asin II, who had fled after participating in an unsuccessful uprising near Mecca. Furthermore, Kharijite rebellions continued to occur regularly. Legitimacy was a scarce and fragile resource in all pre-modern societies. In the early Abbasid environment, competition to define and secure legitimacy was especially intense. The Abbasids came to power vulnerable. Their early actions undermined the unitive potential of their office. Having alienated the Shiites, they liquidated the Umayyad family, one of whom, Abd al-Rahman, escaped and founded his own state in Andalusia. Although the Abbasids were able to buttress their legitimacy by employing the force of their Khorasanian army, by appealing to their piety-minded support, and by emphasizing their position as heirs to the pre-Islamic traditions of rulership, their own circumstances and policies militated against them. Despite their continuing preference for Khorasanian troops, the Absids moved to Iraq, and their execution of Abu Muslim disappointed the Khorasanian chauvinists who had helped them. The non-Muslim majority often rebelled too. Byford ibn Farwardin claimed to be a prophet capable of incorporating both Mazdaism and Islam into a new faith. Hashim ibn Kim, called Al-Mukanna, the Veiled One, around 759 declared himself a prophet and then a god, heir to all previous prophets, to numerous followers of Al, and to Abu Muslim himself. The Absids symbolized their connection with their pre-Islamic predecessors by founding a new capital, Baghdad, near the old Sasanian capital. They also continued to elaborate the Sasanian-like structure begun by the Marwanid governors in Iraq. Their court life became more and more elaborate, the bureaucracy fuller, the inner sanctum of the palace fuller than ever with slaves and concubines, as well as the retinues of the caliph's 4 legal wives. By the time of Harun al-Rashid, ruled 786 to 809, Europe had nothing to compare with Baghdad, not even the court of his contemporary Charlemagne, ruled 768 to 814. But problems surfaced too. Slave sons fathered by Muslims were not slaves and so could compete for the succession. Despite the Absids' defense of Islam, unconverted Jews and Christians could be influential at court. The head, vizier, or wazir, of the financial bureaucracy sometimes became the effective head of government by taking over the chancery as well. Like all absolute rulers, the Absid caliph soon confronted the insoluble dilemma of absolutism. The monarch cannot be absolute unless he depends on helpers, but his dependence on helpers undermines his absolutism. Harun al-Rashid experienced this paradox in a particularly painful way, having drawn into his service prominent members of a family of Buddhist converts, the Barmakids. He found them such rivals that he liquidated them within a matter of years. It was also during Harun's reign that Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab, a trusted governor in Tunis, founded a dynasty that gradually became independent, as did the Hirids, the Absid governors in Khorasan. 2 decades later, the Absids' ability to rival their pre-Islamic predecessors was enhanced by their generous patronage of artists and artisans of all kinds. The great 7,000-mile Silk Road from Chang'an, now Xi'an, China, to Baghdad, then the 2 largest cities in the world, helped provide the wealth. The ensuing literary florescence was promoted by the capture of a group of Chinese papermakers at the Battle of Talas in 751. The Absids encouraged translation from pre-Islamic languages, particularly Middle Persian, Greek, and Syriac. This activity provided a channel through which older thought could enter and be reoriented by Islamicate societies. In the field of mathematics, Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name the word algorithm is derived, creatively combined Hellenistic and Sanskritic concepts. The word algebra derives from the title of his major work, Kitab al-Jabr wa al-Muqabala, the Book of Integration and Equation. Movements such as falsafa, a combination of the positive sciences with logic and metaphysics, and kalam, systematic theological discourse, applied Hellenistic thought to new questions. The translation of Indo-Persian lore promoted the development of adab, a name for a sophisticated prose literature as well as the set of refined urbane manners that characterized its clientele. Soon a movement called Shabiyah arose to champion the superiority of non-Arabic tastes over the alleged crudeness of the poetry so dear to Arabic litterateurs. However, the great writer of early Absid times, Al-Ji, produced a type of adab that fused pre-Islamic and Islamic concerns in excellent Arabic style. Many of these extra-Islamic resources conflicted with Islamic expectations. Ibn al-Makaffa, an administrator under Al-Manar, ruled 754 to 775, urged his master to emulate pre-Islamic models, lest the law that the religious specialists, the ulama, were developing undermine caliphal authority irrevocably. The Absids never acted on such advice completely, they even contravened it by appealing for piety-minded support. Having encouraged conversion, they tried to purify the Muslim community of what they perceived to be socially dangerous and alien ideas. Al-Mahdi, ruled 775 to 785, actively persecuted the Manichaeans, whom he defined as heretics so as to deny them status as a protected community. He also tried to identify Manichaeans who had joined the Muslim community without abandoning their previous ideas and practices. Absid, purification of Islam, ironically coincided with some of the most significant absorption of pre-Islamic monotheistic lore to date, as illustrated by the stories of the prophets written by Alkes, grammarian and tutor to a royal prince. Even though, like the Marwanids, the Absids continued to maintain administrative courts, not accessible to the Qa with Macrones, they also promoted the study of ilm and the status of those who pursued it. In so doing they fostered what Ibn al-Makaffa had feared, the emergence of an independent body of law, shara, which Muslims could use to evaluate and circumvent caliphal rule itself. A key figure in the development of shara was Abu Abd Allah al-Shafii, who died in 820. By his time Islamic law was extensive but uncoordinated, reflecting differing local needs and tastes. Schools had begun to form around various recognized masters, such as Alaz in Syria, Abu Anfa in Iraq, and Malik ibn Anas, all of whom used some combination of local custom, personal reasoning, Qur'an, and hadith. Al-Shafii was raised in Mecca, studied with Malik, participated in a Shiite revolt in the Yemen, and was sent to Baghdad as a prisoner of the caliph. After his release he emigrated to Egypt, where he produced his most famous work. Like most other faqihs, students of jurisprudence, or fiqh, al-Shafii viewed Muhammad's community as a social ideal and his first four successors as rightly guided. So that this exemplary time could provide the basis for Islamic law, he constructed a hierarchy of legal sources, Qur'an, hadith, clearly traceable to Muhammad and in some cases to his companions, ijm, consensus, and qiyas, analogy to one of the first three. The way in which Islamic law had developed had allowed many pre-Islamic customs, such as the veiling and seclusion of women, to receive a sanction not given to them in the Qur'an or the Hadith. Al-Shafii did not change that entirely. Law continued to be pursued in different centers, and several major ways, madhabs, began to coalesce among Sunnis and Shiites alike. Among Sunnis, for schools came to be preeminent, Shafi'iyya, Shafi'ites, Malikiyya, Malikites, Hanafiya, Hanafites, and Hanbala, Hanbalites, and each individual Muslim was expected to restrict himself to only one. Furthermore, the notion that the gate of ijtihad, personal effort at reasoning, closed in the 9th century was not firmly established until the 12th century. However, al-Shafi'i's system was widely influential in controlling divergence and in limiting undisciplined forms of personal reasoning. It also stimulated the collecting and testing of hadiths for their unbroken traceability to Muhammad or a companion. The need to verify hadith stimulated a characteristic form of pre-modern Muslim intellectual and literary activity, the collecting of biographical materials into compendiums, abact. By viewing the Qur'an and documentable Sunnah as preeminent, al-Shafii also undermined those in Absid court circles who wanted a more flexible base from which the caliph could operate. The Shara came to be a supremely authoritative, comprehensive set of norms and rules covering every aspect of life, from worship to personal hygiene. It applied equally to all Muslims, including the ruler, whom Shara-minded Muslims came to view as its protector, not its administrator or developer. While the caliphs were toying with theocratic notions of themselves as the shadow of God on earth, the students of legal knowledge were defining their rule as nomocratic, based only on the law they protected and enforced. According to the Shara, a Muslim order was one in which the ruler was Muslim and the Shara was enshrined as a potential guide to all. Muslims were one confessional community among many, each of which would have its own laws that would apply except in disputes between members of different communities. The Shara regulated relations and inequities among different segments of society, freeborn Muslim, slave, and protected non-Muslim. The process that produced Shara resembled the evolution of oral Torah and rabbinic law, which the Shara resembled in its comprehensiveness, egalitarianism, and consensualism, in its absorption of local custom, in its resistance to distinguishing the sublime from the mundane, and in its independence from government. Like many Jews, many ultra-pious Muslims came to view the law as a divine rather than human creation. During the reign of Al-Imam, 813 to 833, the implications of all this ilm-based activity for caliphal authority began to become clear. Al-Mam came to the caliphate as the result of the fourth fitna, which reflected the persisting alienation of Khorasan. Al-Mam's father, Harun al-Rashid, provided for the empire to be divided at his death between two sons. Al-Amin would rule in the capital and all the western domains, and Al-Mam, from his provincial seat at Merv in Khorasan, would rule the less significant east. When Harun died, his sons struggled to expand their control. Al-Mam won. During his reign, which probably represents the high point of caliphal absolutism, the court intervened in an unprecedented manner in the intellectual life of its Muslim subjects, who for the next generation engaged in the first major intra-Muslim conflict that focused on belief as well as practice. The Muslims, who now constituted a much more sizable proportion of the population but whose faith lacked doctrinal clarity, began to engage in an argument reminiscent of second-century Christian discussions of the Logos. Among Christians, for whom the Word was Jesus, the argument had taken a Christological form. But for Muslims the argument had to center on the Quran and its created or uncreated nature. Al-Mam, as well as his brother and successor Al-Mutaim, 833–842, was attracted to the Mutazilites, whose school had been influenced by Hellenistic ideas as well as by contact with non-Muslim theologians. If the Quran were eternal along with God, his unity would, for the Mutazila, be violated. They especially sought to avoid literal exegesis of the Quran, which in their view discouraged free will and produced embarrassing inconsistencies and anthropomorphisms. By arguing that the Quran was created in time, they could justify metaphorical and changing interpretation. By implication, Muhammad's position as deliverer of revelation was undermined because hadith was made less authoritative. The opponents of the Mutazila, and therefore of the official position, coalesced around the figure of Ahmad ibn Anbal. A leading master of hadith, he had many followers, some of them recent converts, whom he was able to mobilize in large public demonstrations against the doctrine of the created Quran. Because viewing the Quran as created would invalidate its absolute authority, Ibn Anbal argued for an eternal Quran and emphasized the importance of Muhammad's Sunnah to the understanding of it. By his time, major literary works had established a coherent image of the indispensability of Muhammad's prophethood. In fact, just before the Mutazilite controversy began, Ibn Hisham had produced his classic recension of the Sirah, or life, of Muhammad, composed half a century earlier by Ibn Ishq. As in the early Christian Church, these were not merely dogmatic issues. They were rooted in the way ordinary Muslims lived, just as affection for a divine Christ had become popular sentiment by the time Arius and Athanasius debated. Although Muslims lacked an equivalent of the Christian Church, they resolved these issues similarly. Like Jesus for the Christians, the Quran for the Muslims was somehow part of God. Hadith-mindedness and emulation of Muhammad's Sunnah had become such an essential part of the daily life of ordinary people that the Mutazilite position, as intellectually consistent and attractive as it was unmarketable. In a series of forcible inquiries called Mina, Al-Mam and Al-Mutaim actively persecuted those who, like Ibn Anbal, would not conform, but popular sentiment triumphed, and after Al-Mutaim's death the Caliph Al-Mutawakkil was forced to reverse the stand of his predecessors. This caliphal failure to achieve doctrinal unity coincided with other crises. By Al-Mutaim's reign the tribal troops were becoming unreliable and the Hirid governors of Khorasan more independent. Al-Mutaim expanded his use of military slaves, finding them more loyal but more unruly too. Soon he had to house them at Smar, a new capital north of Baghdad, where the caliphate remained until 892. For most of this period, the caliphs were actually under the control of their slave soldiery, and, even though they periodically reasserted their authority, rebellions continued. Many were anti-Muslim, like that of the Iranian Babak, whose 20-year-long revolt was crushed in 837, but increasingly they were intra-Muslim, like the Kharijite-led revolt of black agricultural slaves, Zanj, in southern Iraq, 869–883. By 870 then, the Baghdad Smar Caliphate had become one polity among many, its real rulers had no ideological legitimacy. At Córdoba the Umayyads had declared their independence, and the Maghreb was divided among several dynasties of differing persuasions, the Shiite Idrisids, the Kharijite Rustamids, and the Jamsuni Aghlabids. The former governors of the Absids, the Lanids, ruled Egypt and parts of Arabia. Iran was divided between the Afrids, governors of the Absids in the south, and the Persian Samanids in the north. The centrifugal forces represented by these administrative divisions should not obscure, however, the existence of numerous centripetal forces that continued to give Islamdom, from Andalusia to Central Asia, other types of unity. The ideal of the caliphate continued to be a source of unity after the reality waned. Among all the new states, no alternative to the caliphate could replace it. Furthermore, now that Muslims constituted a majority almost everywhere in Islamdom, conflict began to be expressed almost exclusively in Islamic rather than anti-Islamic forms. In spite of continuing intra-Muslim conflict, Muslim worship and belief remained remarkably uniform. The annual pilgrimage to Mecca helped reinforce this underlying unity by bringing disparate Muslims together in a common rite. The pilgrimage, as well as the rise of prosperous regional urban centers, enhanced the trade that traversed Islamdom regardless of political conflicts. Along the trade routes that crisscrossed Eurasia, Islamdom at its center, moved not only techniques and goods but ideas as well. A network of credit and banking, caravansaries, and intercity mercantile alliances tied far-flung regions together. Central was the caravan, then the world's most effective form of transport. The peripatetic nature of education promoted cross-fertilization. Already the fakir, a wandering mendicant Sufi dervish, was a familiar traveler. Across Islamdom, similar mosque market complexes sprang up in most towns. Because municipal institutions were rare, political stability so unpredictable, and government intervention kept to a minimum, sometimes by design, more often by necessity, the Shara and the learned men who carried it became a mainstay of everyday life and social intercourse. The Shara, along with the widespread affection for the Sunnah of Muhammad, regulated, at least among pious Muslims, personal habits of the most specific sort, from the use of scent to the cut of a beard. Comprehensive and practical, the Sunnah could amuse as well. When asked whether to trust in God or tie one's camel, so a popular hadith goes, the Prophet replied, "Trust in God, then tie your camel." The significance of hadith and Sunnah is represented by the ending date of the period of conversion and crystallization. No one can say exactly when the majority of Islamdom's population became Muslim. Older scholarship looks to the end of the first quarter of the 9th century, newer scholarship to the beginning of the 3rd quarter. In 870 a man died whose life's work symbolized the consolidation of Islam in everyday life, al-Bukhari, who produced one of the 6 collections of hadith recognized as authoritative by Jamsuni Muslims. His fellow collector of hadith, Muslim Ibn al-Ajj, died about 4 years later. About the same time, classical thinkers in other areas of Islamic civilization died, among them the great author of Adab, al-Ji, died 868-869, the great early ecstatic Sufis Abu al-Faydhu al-Nun al-Mir, died 861, and Abu Yazid Bizm, died 874, the philosopher Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Ab al-Kindi, died c. 870, and the historian of the conquests al-Baladuri, died c. 892. Men of different religious and ethnic heritages, they signified by the last quarter of the 9th century the full and varied range of intellectual activities of a civilization that had come of age. The unifying forces operative at the end of the period of conversion and crystallization persisted during the period of fragmentation and florescence, but the caliphal lands in Iraq became less central. Even though Baghdad remained preeminent in cultural prestige, important initiatives were being taken from surrounding regions, Andalusia, the Maghreb and Sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities, Mecca and Medina, Iraq, and Iran, Afghanistan, Transoxania, and, toward the end of the period, northern India. Regional courts could compete with the Absids and with each other as patrons of culture. Interregional and intraregional conflicts were often couched in terms of loyalties formed in the period of conversion and crystallization, but local history provided supplemental identities. Although the Abbasid Caliphate was still a focus of concern and debate, other forms of leadership became important. Just as being Muslim no longer meant being Arab, being cultured no longer meant speaking and writing exclusively in Arabic. Certain Muslims began to cultivate a second language of high culture, New Persian. As in pre-Islamic times, written as well as spoken bilingualism became important. Ethnic differences were blurred by the effects of peripatetic education and shared languages. Physical mobility was so common that many individuals lived and died far from their places of birth. Cultural creativity was so noticeable that this period is often called the Renaissance of Islam. Economic changes also promoted regional strengths. Although Baghdad continued to profit from its central location, caliphal neglect of Iraq's irrigation system and southerly shifts in the Trans-Asian trade promoted the fortunes of Egypt. The opening of the Sahara to Maghribi Muslims provided a new source of slaves, salt, and minerals, and Egyptian expansion into the Mediterranean opened a major channel for Islamicate influence on medieval Europe. Islamdom continued to expand, sometimes as the result of aggression on the part of frontier warriors, Ghazis, but more often as the result of trade. The best symbol of this expansiveness is Ibn Falun, who left a provocative account of his mission in 921, on behalf of the Baghdad Caliph, to the Volga Bulgars, among whom he met Swedes coming down the river to trade. By the beginning of the period of fragmentation and fluorescence, the subject populations of most Muslim rulers were predominantly Muslim, and non-sedentary peoples had ceased to play a major role. The period gave way to a much longer period, dated 1041 to 1405, in which migratory tribal peoples were once again critically important. In 1041 the reign of the Ghaznavid Sultan Masti ended. By then the Ghaznavid state had lost control over the Seljuk Turks in their eastern Iranian domains and thus inaugurated Islamdom's second era of tribal expansion. Because localism and cosmopolitanism coexisted in the period of fragmentation and fluorescence, the period is best approached through a region-by-region survey that underscores phenomena of interregional significance. Andalusia, far from the center of Islamdom, illustrated the extent of Abbasid prestige and the assertion of local creativity. In the beginning of the period, Islamicate rule was represented by the Umayyads at Córdoba, established in 756 by Abd al-Rahim I, known as al-Dakhil, the immigrant, a refugee from the Abbasid victory over the Syrian Umayyads. The Umayyad dynasty in Córdoba replaced a string of virtually independent deputies of the Umayyad governors in the Maghreb. At first the Córdoban Umayyads had styled themselves emirs, the title also used by caliphal governors and other local rulers. Though refugees from Abbasid hostility, they continued to mention the Abbasids in the Friday worship session until 773. Their independence was not made official, however, until their best-known member, Abd al-Rahim III, ruled 912 to 961, adopted the title of Caliph in 929 and began having the Friday prayer recited in the name of his own house. The fact that Abd al-Rahim declared his independence from the Abbasids while he modeled his court after theirs illustrates the period's cultural complexities. Like that of the Abbasids and the Marwanids, Abd al-Rahim's absolute authority was limited by the nature of his army, Amazigh tribesmen and Slav slaves, and by his dependence on numerous assistants. His internal problems were compounded by external threats, from the Christian kingdoms in the north and the Fimids in the Maghreb, see below. The Umayyad state continued to be the major Muslim presence in the peninsula until 1010, after which time it became, until 1031, but one of many independent city-states. Nowhere is the connection between fragmentation and fluorescence more evident than in the courts of these Muluk Alawif, or party kings. It was they who patronized some of Andalusia's most brilliant Islamicate culture. This fluorescence also demonstrated the permeability of the Muslim-Christian frontier. For example, the poet and theologian Ibn Azm, 994 to 1064, composed love poetry, such as Ak Alama, the Ring of the Dove, which may have contributed to ideas of chivalric love among the Provençal troubadours. In 870 the Maghreb was divided among several dynasties, all but one of foreign origin and only one of which, the Aghlabids, nominally represented the Absids. The Muslim Arabs had been very different rulers than any of their predecessors, Phoenicians, Romans, Vandals, or Byzantines, who had occupied but not settled. Their interests in North Africa had been secondary to their objectives in the Mediterranean, so they had restricted themselves to coastal settlements, which they used as staging points for trade with the Western Mediterranean or as sources of food for their metropolitan population. They had separated themselves from the Amazigh with a fortified frontier. The Arabs, however, forced away from the coast in order to compete more effectively with the Byzantines, had quickly tried to incorporate the Amazigh, who were also pastoralists. One branch of the Amazigh, the Anja, extended far into the Sahara, across which they had established a caravan trade with blacks in the Sudanic belt. At some time in the 10th century the Anja nominally converted to Islam, and their towns in the Sahara began to assume Muslim characteristics. Around 990 a black kingdom in the Sudan, Ghana, extended itself as far as Otagost, the Anja center in the Sahara. Thus was Black Africa first brought into contact with the Muslim Mediterranean, and thus were the conditions set for dramatic developments in the Maghreb during the 12th and 13th centuries. See below migration and renewal. In the late 9th century the Maghreb was unified and freed from outside control for the first time. Paradoxically, this independence was achieved by outsiders associated with an international movement of political activism and subversion. Driven underground by Absid intolerance and a maturing ideology of covert revolutionism, the Ismail Shiites had developed mechanisms to maintain solidarity and undertake political action. These mechanisms can be subsumed under the term Da'wah, the same word that had been used for the movement that brought the Absids to power. The Da'wah's ability to communicate rapidly over a large area rested on its traveling operatives as well as on a network of local cells. In the late 9th century an Ismail movement, nicknamed the Karmaya, Karmatians, had seriously but unsuccessfully threatened the Absids in Syria, Iraq, and Bahrain. Seeking other outlets, a Yemeni operative known as Abu Abd Allah al-Sh made contact, on the occasion of the Hajj, with representatives of a Amazigh tribe that had a history of Kharijite hostility to caliphal control. The Hajj had already become a major vehicle for tying Islamdom's regions together, and Abu Abd Allah's movement was only one of many in the Maghreb that would be inaugurated thereby. In 901 Abu Abd Allah arrived in Little Kabylia, in present-day Algeria. For 8 years he prepared for an imam, preaching of a millennial restoration of justice after an era of foreign oppression. After conquering the Aghlabid capital Al-Kairouan, in present-day Tunisia, he helped free from a Sijil Massa prison his imam, Abaid Allah, who declared himself the Mahdi, using a multivalent word that could have quite different meanings for different constituencies. Some Muslims applied Mahdi to any justice-restoring divinely guided figure, others, including many Jamsunis, to the apocalyptic figure expected to usher in the millennium before the Last Judgment, and still others, including most Shiites, to a returned or restored imam. Abu Abd Allah's followers may have differed in their expectations, but the Mahdi himself was unequivocal. He was a descendant of Al and Fima through Ismail's disappeared son and therefore was a continuation of the line of the true imam. He symbolized his victory by founding a new capital named, after himself, Al-Mahdiyah, in present-day Tunisia. During the next half-century the Fimids tried with limited success to expand westward into the Maghreb and north into the Mediterranean, where they made Sicily a naval base, 912 to 913, but their major goal was Egypt, nominally under Absid control. From Egypt they would challenge the Absid Caliphate itself. In 969 the Fimid army conquered the Nile Valley and advanced into Palestine and southern Syria as well. The Fimids established a new and glorious city, Al-Qahira, the victorious, Cairo, to rival Absid Baghdad. They then adopted the title of Caliph, laying claim to be the legitimate rulers of all Muslims as well as head of all Ismails. Now 3 caliphs reigned in Islamdom, where there was supposed to be only one. In Cairo, the Fimids founded a great mosque school complex, Al-Azhar. They fostered local handicraft production and revitalized the Red Sea route from India to the Mediterranean. They built up a navy to trade as well as to challenge the Byzantines and underscore the Abbasid caliph's failure to defend and extend the frontiers. Fimid occupation of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, complete by the end of the 10th century, had economic as well as spiritual significance. It reinforced the caliph's claim to leadership of all Muslims, provided wealth, and helped him keep watch on the West Arabian coast, from the Hijaz to the Yemen, where a sympathetic Zaydishite dynasty had ruled since 897. Fimid presence in the Indian Ocean was even strong enough to establish an Ismail missionary in Sindh. The Fimids patronized the arts. Fimid glass and ceramics were some of Islamdom's most brilliant. As in other regions, imported styles and tastes were transformed by or supplemented with local artistic impulses, especially in architecture, the most characteristic form of Islamicate art. The reign of one of the most unusual Fimid caliphs, Al-Kim, from 996 to 1021, again demonstrated the interregional character of the Ismail movement. Historians describe Al-Kim's personal habits as eccentric, mercurial, and unpredictable to the point of cruelty, and his religious values as inconsistent with official Ismail teachings, tending toward some kind of accommodation with the Jam Sunni majority. After he vanished under mysterious circumstances, his religious revisionism was not pursued by his successors or by the Ismail establishment in Egypt, but in Syria it inspired a peasant revolt that produced the Druze, who still await Al-Kim's return. When the Fimids expanded into southern Syria, another Shiite dynasty, the Amnids, of Bedouin origin, had been ruling northern Syria from Mosul since 905. In 944 a branch of the family had taken Aleppo, under the leadership of their most famous member, Sef al-Dawla, ruled c. 943 to 967. The Amnids responded aggressively to renewed Byzantine expansionism in eastern Anatolia. They ruled from Aleppo until they were absorbed by the Fimids after 1004. At their court some of Islamdom's most lastingly illustrious writers found patronage. Two notable examples are the poet Al-Mutanabi, 915 to 965, who illustrated the importance of the poet as a pre-modern press agent of the court, and Al-Farabi, who tried to reconcile reason and revelation. Al-Farabi contributed to the ongoing Islamization of Hellenistic thought. Falsafa, the Arabic cognate for the Greek philosophia, included metaphysics and logic, as well as the positive sciences, such as mathematics, music, astronomy, and anatomy. Philosophers often earned their living as physicians, astrologers, or musicians. The philosopher's whole way of life, like that of the adib, reflected his studies. It was often competitive with that of more self-consciously observant Muslims because the philosopher often questioned the relationship of revelation to real truth. The philosophers felt free to explore inner truths not exposed to the view of ordinary people. They practiced prudent concealment, taqiyya, of their deeper awareness wherever making it public might endanger the social order. The philosophers shared the principle of concealment with the Shiites. Both believed, for rather different reasons, that inner truth was accessible to only a very few. This esotericism had counterparts in all pre-modern societies, where learning and literacy were severely restricted. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the last remnant of the caliphal state was Iraq, under control of the Turkic soldiery. Political decline and instability did not preclude cultural creativity and productivity, however. In fact, Iraq's generation of 870, loosely construed, contained some of the most striking and lastingly important figures in all of early Islamicate civilization. Three of them illustrate well the range of culture in late 9th and early 10th century Iraq: the historian and Kurnic exegete Alabar, c. 839 to 923, the theologian Abu al-Hasan al-Ashar, c. 873 c. 935, and the ecstatic mystic Al-Alj, c. 858 to 922. Alabar was born in Abaristan, south of the Caspian Sea, and as a young man he traveled to Baghdad. Rarely could a man earn his living from religious learning, unless he found patronage, he would probably engage in trade or a craft. All the more astounding was the productivity of scholars like Alabar, who said that he produced 40 leaves a day for 40 years. The size of his extant works, which include a commentary on the Quran and a universal history, testifies to the accuracy of his claim. His history is unique in sheer size and detail, and especially in its long-term impact. His method involved the careful selection, organization, and juxtaposition of separate and often contradictory accounts cast in the form of hadith. This technique celebrated the Ummah's collective memory and established a range of acceptable disagreement. Al-Ashar, from Basra, made his contribution to systematic theological discourse, kalam. He had been attracted early to a leading Mu'tazilite teacher, but he broke away at the age of 40. He went on to use Mu'tazilite methods of reasoning to defend popular ideas such as the eternality and literal truth of the Quran and the centrality of Muhammad's Sunnah as conveyed by the Hadith. Where his approach yielded objectionable results, such as an anthropomorphic rendering of God or a potentially polytheistic understanding of his attributes, Al-Ashar resorted to the principle of bila kayf, without regard to the how, whereby a person of faith accepts that certain fundamentals are true without regard to how they are true, and that divine intention is not always accessible to human intelligence. Al-Ashar's harmonization also produced a simple creed, which expressed faith in God, his angels, and his books, and affirmed belief in Muhammad as God's last messenger and in the reality of death, physical resurrection, the Last Judgment, and heaven and hell. Taken together, Alabar's historiography and Al-Ashar's theology symbolize the consolidation of Jamsuni, Shara-minded thought and piety. The most visible and powerful 10th-century exponent of Sufism was Al-Alj. By his day, Sufism had grown far beyond its early forms, which were represented by Al-Hasan al-Bar, died 728, who practiced Zuhd, or rejection of the world, and by Rubaiyah al-Adawiyya, died 801, who formulated the Sufi ideal of a disinterested love of God. The mystics Abu Yazid Bitm, died 874, and Abu al-Qasim al-Junayd, died 910, had begun to pursue the experience of unity with God, first by being drunk with his love and with love of him, and then by acquiring life-transforming self-possession and control. Masters, called sheikhs or peers, were beginning to attract disciples, murids, to their way. Like other Muslims who tried to go beyond the shara to inner truth, the Sufis practiced concealment of inner awareness, taqiyya. Al-Alj, one of al-Junayd's disciples, began to travel and preach publicly, however. His success was disturbing enough for the authorities in Baghdad to have him arrested and condemned to death. He was tortured and beheaded, and finally his body was burned. Yet his career had shown the power of Sufism, which would by the 12th century become an institutionalized form of Islamic piety. Long before, however, a major political change occurred at Baghdad. In 945, control over the caliphs passed from their Turkish soldiery to a dynasty known as the Buyids or Buwayhids. The Buyids came from Daylam, near the southern coast of the Caspian Sea. Living beyond the reach of the caliphs in Baghdad, its residents had identified with Imami schism. By about 933, sons of a fisherman named Baya had emerged as leaders in Daylam. One of them conquered Baghdad, not replacing the caliph but ruling in his name. The fact that they were Shiite, as were the Idrisids, Fimids, and Amnids, led scholars to refer to the period from the mid-10th to mid-11th century as the Shiite century. Like other contemporary rulers, the Buyids were patrons of culture, especially of speculative thought, schism, Mu'tazilism, kalam, and falsafa. Jamsuni learning continued to be patronized by the caliphs and their families. The Buyids favored no one party over another. However, their openness paradoxically invited a hardening in Jamsuni thought. Buyid attempts to maintain the cultural brilliance of the court at Baghdad were limited by a decline in revenue occasioned partly by a shift in trade routes to Fimid Egypt, and partly by long-term neglect of Iraq's irrigation works. The caliphs had occasionally made land assignments, to soldiers in lieu of paying salaries. Now the Buyids extended the practice to other individuals and thus removed an important source of revenue from central control. After 983, Buyid territories were split among various members of the family, and pressure was applied to their borders from both the west, by Amnids and Fimids, and the east, by Samanids, Ghaznavids, and Seljuks. The economic difficulties of Buyid Iraq promoted urban unrest, accounts of which provide a rare glimpse into the lives of ordinary Muslim town dwellers. Numerous movements served as outlets for socio-economic grievances, directed most often toward the wealthy or the military. The concentration of wealth in the cities had produced a bipolar stratification system conveyed in the sources by a pair of words, kha with macron, special, and a with macron ordinary. In the environment of 10th and 11th century Iraq, an instance of rising food prices or official maltreatment could easily spark riots of varying size, duration, and intensity. Strategies for protest included raiding, looting, and assault. Some movements were more coherently ideological than others, and various forms of piety could reflect socio-economic distinctions. Some movements were particularly attractive to artisans, servants, and soldiers, as was the case with the proponents of Hadith, whose mentor, Ahmad ibn Anbal, died 855, was viewed as a martyr because of his suffering at the hands of the caliph. Other forms of piety, such as schism, could be associated with wealthier elements among the landowning and merchant classes. Beneath the more organized forms of social action lay a more fluid kind of association, most often described by the labels ayr and futawa. These terms refer to individuals acting in concert, as needed, on the basis of certain rough-hewn concepts of proper male public behavior. Such associations had counterparts in the late Hellenistic world, just as they have parallels in the voluntary protective associations formed in the 19th and 20th centuries whenever official institutions of protection were either chronically or temporarily deficient. For some of the Islamic eight gangs, or clubs, thuggery may have been the norm. For others, the figure of the fourth caliph and first imam, al, seems to have provided an exemplar. Even though Shiites had become a separate group with a distinctive interpretation of Allah's significance, a more generalized affection for the family of the Prophet and especially for Al was widespread among Jamsunis. Al had come to be recognized as the archetypal young male. Fata, a related word, futawa, signified groups of young men who pursued such virtues as courage, aiding the weak, generosity, endurance of suffering, love of truth, and hospitality. Pre-modern Islamic societies were characterized by a high degree of fluidity, occasionalism, and voluntarism in the structuring of associations, organizations, loyalties, and occupations. Although all societies must develop ways to maintain social boundaries, ease interaction among groups, and buffer friction, the ways in which Muslim societies have fulfilled these needs seem unusually difficult to delineate. For example, in Muslim cities of the period under discussion, the only official officeholders were appointees of the central government, such as the governor, the mutasib, a transformed Byzantine agronomos who was monitor of public morality as well as of fair market practice, or the Ib al-Shura, head of the police. In the absence of an organized church or ordained clergy, those whose influence derived from piety or learning were influential because they were recognized as such, not because they were appointed, and men of very different degrees of learning might earn the designation of lim. Although the ruler was expected to contribute to the maintenance of public services, neither he nor anyone else was obligated to do so. Though the ruler might maintain prisons for those whose behavior he disapproved, the local qa with macrones had need of none, relying generally on persuasion or negotiation and borrowing the caliphal police on the relatively rare occasion on which someone needed to be brought before them by force. There was no formalized mode of succession for any of the dynasties of the time. Competition, sometimes armed, was relied upon to produce the most qualified candidate. Patronage was an important basis of social organization. The family served as a pre-modern welfare agency. Where it was absent, minimal public institutions, such as hospitals, provided. One of the most important funding mechanisms for public services was a private one, the Waqf. The Waqf provided a legal way to circumvent the Shariah's requirement that an individual's estate be divided among many heirs. Through a waqf, an individual could endow an institution or group with all or part of his estate, in perpetuity, before his death. A waqf might provide books for a school, candles or mats for a mosque, salaries of religious functionaries, or land for a hospital or caravansary. Waqf money or lands were indivisible, although they might contribute to the welfare of a potential heir who happened to be involved in the waqf-supported activity. The waqf, like other forms of patronage, provided needed social services without official intervention. On other occasions, wealthy individuals, especially those connected with the ruling family, might simply patronize favorite activities. In addition to patronage, many other overlapping ties bound individual Muslims together: loyalties to an occupation, soldier, merchant, learned man, artisan, government worker, and loyalties to a town or neighborhood, or to a form of piety, or to persons to whom one made an oath for a specific purpose, and ties to patron or to family, especially foster parentage, ayin, the counterpart of which was significant in medieval Christendom. The Kern and Shara discouraged corporate responsibility in favor of individual action. Even the legal scope of partnership was limited. Yet the unstable political realities that had militated against the emergence of broad-based institutions sometimes called for corporate action, as when a city came to terms with a new ruler or invader. In those cases, a vaguely defined group of notables, known usually as Ain, might come together to represent their city in negotiations, only to cease corporate action when the more functional small group loyalties could safely be resumed. Within this shifting frame of individuals and groups, the ruler was expected to maintain a workable, if not equitable, balance. More often than not, the real ruler was a local emir of some sort. For this reason, the de facto system of rule that emerged during this period, despite the persistence of the central caliphate in Baghdad, has sometimes been referred to as the Ain Emir system. The city's physical and social organization reflected this complex relationship between public and private and between individual and group: physically separated quarters, multiple markets and mosques, maze-like patterns of narrow streets and alleys with dwellings oriented toward an inner courtyard, and absence of public meeting places other than bath, market, and mosque, and the concentration of social life in private residences. The Qa with Makran and Adib al-Tanuki provides a lively and humorous picture of 10th-century Baghdad, of a society of individuals with overlapping affiliations and shifting statuses, saints and scoundrels, heroes and rogues, rich men and poor. This mobility is illustrated by al-Tanuki's boast to a rival: "My line begins with me while yours ends with you." The prose genre of Makama, said to have been invented by al-Hamadani, died 1008, recounted the exploits of a clever, articulate scoundrel dependent on his own wits for his survival and success. In the middle of the Shiite century, a major Sunni revival occurred in Eastern Islamdom in connection with the emergence of the second major language of Islamicate high culture, New Persian. This double revival was accomplished by two Iranian dynasties, the Samanids and the Ghaznavids. Ghaznavid zeal even spilled over into India. The Samanid dynasty, 819 to 999, stemmed from a local family appointed by the Absids to govern at Bokhara and Samarkand. Gradually the Samanids had absorbed the domains of the rebellious Hirids and Afrids in northeastern Iran and reduced the Afrids to a small state in Sistan. The Samanids, relying on Turkic slave troops, also managed to contain the migratory pastoralist Turkic tribes who continually pressed on Iran from across the Oxus River. In the 950s they even managed to convert some of these Turkic tribes to Islam. The Samanid court at Bokhara attracted leading scholars, such as the philosophers Abu Bakr al-Razi, died 925 or 935, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, 980 to 1037. Who later worked for the Buyids, and the poet Ferdowsi, died c. 1020. Though not Shiites, the Samanids expressed an interest in Shiite thought, especially in its Ismail form, which was then the locus of so much intellectual vitality. The Samanids also fostered the development of a second Islamicate language of high culture, New Persian. It combined the grammatical structure and vocabulary of spoken Persian with vocabulary from Arabic, the existing language of high culture in Iran. A landmark of this Persianizing of Iran was Ferdowsi's epic poem, the Shahnameh, Book of Kings, written entirely in New Persian in a long couplet form, Masnavi, derived from Arabic. Covering several thousand years of detailed mythic Iranian history, Ferdowsi brought Iran's ancient heroic lore, and its hero Rustam, into Islamicate literature and into the identity of self-consciously Iranian Muslims. He began to compose the poem under the rule of the Samanids, but he dedicated the finished work to a dynasty that had meanwhile replaced them, the Ghaznavids. The Ghaznavid dynasty was born in a way that had become routine for Islamicate polities. Sebuktigin, ruled 977 to 997, a Samanid Turkic slave governor in Ghazna, now Ghazni, in the Afghan mountains, made himself independent of his masters as their central power declined. His eldest son, Mahmud, expanded into Bayid territory in western Iran, identifying himself staunchly with Sunni Islam. Presenting himself as a frontier warrior against the pagans, Mahmud invaded and plundered northwestern India, establishing a permanent rule in the Punjab, but it was through ruling Iran, which gave a Muslim ruler true prestige, that Mahmud sought to establish himself. He declared his loyalty to the Abbasid Caliph, whose investiture he sought, and expressed his intention to defend Sunni Islam against the Shiite Bayids. Although he and his regime were proud of their Turkic descent, Mahmud encouraged the use of New Persian, with its echoes of pre-Islamic Iranian glory, for administration and for prose as well as poetry. This combination of Turkic identity and Persian language would characterize and empower many other Muslim rulers. To Ghazna Mahmud brought, sometimes by force, writers and artisans who could adorn his court. Among these was Al-Brn, 973 c. 1050, whose scholarly achievements no contemporary could rival. Before being brought to Ghazna, Al-Brn had served the Samanids and the Khwarazmshahs, a local dynasty situated just west of the Oxus River. Al-Brn's works included studies of astronomy. He even suggested a heliocentric universe, gems, drugs, mathematics, and physics, but his most famous book, inspired by accompanying Mahmud on his Indian campaigns, was a survey of Indian life, language, religion, and culture. Like most other rulers of the day, Mahmud styled himself an emir and emphasized his loyalty to the caliph in Baghdad, but he and later Ghaznavid rulers also called themselves by the Arabic word sultan. Over the next 5 centuries the office of sultan would become an alternative to caliph. The Ghaznavid state presaged other changes as well, especially by stressing the cleavage between ruler and ruled and by drawing into the ruling class not only the military but also the bureaucracy and the learned establishment. So tied was the ruling establishment to the ruler that it even moved with him on campaign. Ghaznavid political theory shared with other states the concept of the circle of justice or circle of power, i.e., that justice is best preserved by an absolute monarch completely outside society, that such a ruler needs an absolutely loyal army, and that maintaining such an army requires prosperity, which in turn depends on the good management of an absolute ruler. Abu al-Bayhaqi, 995 to 1077, worked in the Ghaznavid chancery and wrote a remarkable history of the Ghaznavids, the first major prose work in New Persian. He exhibited the broad learning of even a relatively minor figure at court. In his history he combined the effective writing skills of the chancery employee, the special knowledge of Qur'an and Hadith, and the sophisticated and entertaining literature, history, poetry, and folklore that characterized the adib. He provided a vivid picture of life at court, graphically portraying the pitfalls of military absolutism, the dependence of the monarch on a fractious military and a large circle of assistants and advisors, who could mislead him and affect his decision-making through internecine maneuvering and competition. In the reign of Mahmud's son, Mast-I, the weaknesses in the system had already become glaringly apparent. At the Battle of Dandenkan, 1040, Mast lost control of Khorasan, his main holding in Iran, to the pastoralist Seljuk Turks. He then decided to withdraw to Lahore in his Indian domains, from which his successors ruled until overtaken by the Ghurids in 1186. By the end of Mast's reign, government in Islamdom had become government by emir. Caliphal centralization had lasted 200 years, even after the Caliphal empire became too large and complex to be ruled from a single center. The separate emirates that replaced it all defined their legitimacy in relation to it, for or against. In fact, the Caliphate's first systematic description and justification was undertaken just when its impracticality was being demonstrated. As the Ghaznavids were ruling in Iran as appointed defenders of the Caliph, a Baghdadi legal scholar named Al-Mawardi, died 1058, retrospectively delineated the minimal requirements of the Caliphate and tried to explain why it had become necessary for caliphal powers to be delegated in order for the Ummah's security to be maintained. Whereas earlier legists had tied the Caliph's legitimacy to his defense of the borders, Al-Mawardi separated the two, maintaining the Caliph as the ultimate source of legitimacy and the guardian of pan-Islamic concerns and relegating day-to-day government to his appointees. Al-Mawardi may have hoped that the Ghaznavids would expand far enough to be invited by the Caliph to replace the uninvited Shiite Buyids. This replacement did occur 3 years before Al-Mawardi's death. However, it was not the Ghaznavids who appeared in Baghdad but rather the migratory pastoralist Turks who had meanwhile replaced them. The Seljuks joined many other migrating groups to produce the next phase of Islamicate history. During this period, migrating peoples once again played a major role, perhaps greater than that of the Arabs during the 7th and 8th centuries. No other civilization in pre-modern history experienced so much in migration, especially of alien and disruptive peoples, or showed a greater ability to assimilate as well as to learn from outsiders. Nowhere has the capacity of a culture to redefine and incorporate the strange and the foreign been more evident. In this period, which ends with the death in 1405 of Timur, Tamerlane, the last great tribal conqueror, the tense yet creative relationship between sedentary and migratory peoples emerged as one of the great themes of Islamicate history, played out as it was in the center of the great arid zone of Eurasia. Because this period can be seen as the history of peoples as well as of regions, and because the mobility of those peoples brought them to more than one cultural region, this period should be treated group by group rather than region by region. As a general term, migrating peoples is preferable because it does not imply aimlessness, as nomadic does, or herding, as pastoralist does, or kin-related, as tribal does. Migrating focuses simply on movement from one home to another. Although the Franks, as the Crusaders are called in Muslim sources, differed from other migrating peoples, most of whom were pastoralists related by kinship, they too were migrating warriors organized to invade and occupy peoples to whom they were hostile and alien. Though not literally tribal, they appeared to behave like a tribe with a distinctive way of life and a solidarity based on common values, language, and objectives. Viewing them as alien immigrants comparable to, say, the Mongols helps to explain their reception, how they came to be assimilated into the local culture and drawn into the intra-Muslim factional competition and fighting that was underway in Syria when they arrived.